The sharp metallic ping of a silver spoon striking crystal cut through the low hum of conversation. The noise echoed across the formal dining room of the Greenwich estate, instantly silencing the 23 guests gathered around the long mahogany table. At the head of the table stood Victoria, my mother. She held her champagne flute aloft, the ambient light from the tiered chandelier catching the delicate glass. She let the quiet stretch, ensuring every aunt, cousin, and extended in-law had their attention firmly anchored to her. Only then did she arrange her features into a mask of theatrical sorrow. Family Victoria began her voice, carrying a fragile, artificial tremor. Thanksgiving is about holding our loved ones close. It is about offering a sanctuary when the world outside becomes unforgiving, especially when one of our own is hurting. She turned her gaze down the length of the table, locking eyes with me. As many of you are already aware, our dear Isabella is navigating a terrible transition, Victoria continued. Julian has chosen to leave her. He has found another woman. A unified intake of breath swept through the room. Relatives I had not spoken to since the previous holiday stared at me. Their expressions held a sickening blend of pity and quiet superiority. A few seats away, my sister-in-law, Sarah, swirled the wine in her glass, the corner of her mouth twitching upward in a suppressed smirk. Beside her, my brother Lucas studied his plate, choosing the familiar comfort of silence over defending his sister. This was a public shaming designed to strip away my dignity. It was a performance meant to end with me relying on my mother's controlling grace. But I did not cry. I sat still, listening to the hushed murmurs. What Victoria failed to realize was that my husband was not with another woman. He was standing in the shadowy foyer right behind the heavy oak dining room doors, holding a thick manila folder filled with verified county records. And what my pitying relatives failed to grasp was that the matriarch giving the toast was legally bankrupt. "This table is about loyalty," Victoria had told me earlier with a tight smile. She had no idea I had spent the last 3 years quietly appraising her lies. Welcome back to Aura Vengeance, where we uncover the toxic secrets families try to bury and follow them all the way to the bitter truth. I am Isabella. I am 32. Drop a comment with your age and let me know where you are listening from, and be sure to subscribe. To understand how we reached this exact second of ruin, you have to rewind 3 hours, to the moment I first walked through the front doors and saw the physical shape of the trap she had set. I appraise high net worth estates for a living. I spend my days walking through mansions in Connecticut, looking for hidden rot behind fresh paint and spotting forged antiquities passed off as heirlooms. Tracking what is real and what is an illusion is just how my brain rests. For 3 years, I kept the illusion of the Garcia family intact. I paid the property taxes when the trust account mysteriously dried up. I covered the country club dues so my mother could maintain her social standing. I did it quietly. I thought that was what a good daughter did. I thought protecting the family name left no fingerprints. That was my mistake. It took a missing plate at Thanksgiving to show me that you do not keep the peace by funding it. You just teach them your boundaries are for sale. We arrived at the estate at 3 in the afternoon. The air outside smelled of wood smoke and incoming snow. Julian was not beside me. He was still in Manhattan, sitting in the secure server room of his cybersecurity firm, pulling the final internet service provider logs we needed. So I walked through the heavy oak doors alone. Victoria met me in the foyer. She wore a tailored emerald dress and a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. She pulled me into a stiff hug. The heavy scent of jasmine perfume and gin washed over me. "Where's Julian?" she asked. Her voice was just loud enough for my cousin David to hear from the parlor. "He had to wrap up an audit in the city," I said, keeping my voice level. Victoria let out a dramatic, breathy sigh. She turned to David and shook her head with practiced sorrow. "Julian needed some space," she murmured, placing a manicured hand over her heart. "We are just giving Isabella all the support she needs today. Men can be so unreliable." David shot me a look of deep, uncomfortable pity. The narrative was already spinning. Before I even took off my winter coat, she was planting the seed. I did not argue. Arguing with Victoria is like wrestling with a ghost. You only exhaust yourself while she floats away untouched. I walked into the kitchen to escape the whispers. The marble island was covered in crystal glasses and silver platters holding hors d'oeuvres. My brother Lucas leaned against the counter, tapping his phone. His wife Sarah stood next to him. Sarah comes from a family with a compound in Cape Cod. She protects her position as the favored daughter-in-law with the vigilance of a guard dog. "Isabella, darling," Sarah cooed. She reached past a row of chilling vintage champagne bottles. Instead, she grabbed an opened bottle of cheap screw-top wine from the back of the fridge. She poured a meager splash into a water glass and slid it across the cold marble toward me. "We are all here for you," Sarah whispered. Her tone dripped with artificial sweetness. "You are so strong for showing up." I looked at the water glass. Then I looked at Lucas. He stared intently at his expensive leather loafers, refusing to meet my eye. He is the golden child. He benefits from the peace I pay for, so he never questions how much it costs me. "Thank you, Sarah," I said. I picked up the glass. I did not drink it. I did not feel the urge to scream or throw the wine in her face. An appraiser does not yell at a crumbling foundation. She just documents the cracks. Sarah pouring me the cheap wine was not just a petty slight. It was a symptom. The famed Garcia vintage wine cellar was gone. I knew that. I had pulled the private auction house liquidation receipts 3 months ago. Victoria was serving the good champagne today only to the people she still needed to impress. I was no longer on that list. I left the kitchen and walked into the formal dining room. The table stretched out like a manicured battlefield. Silver cutlery polished to a blinding shine. Hand-lettered place cards sitting above folded linen napkins. I walked the length of the room doing the math the way I always do. I counted the chairs. 23. Victoria drifted into the room behind me. Her heels clicked a sharp rhythm against the hardwood floor. "I see you noticed the seating," she said. Her voice dropped the public sweetness now that the guests were in the other room. "You removed Julian from the table," I said. Victoria reached out and adjusted a crystal water goblet a fraction of an inch. "Let us be honest, Isabella. He is not coming. It is better to just accept the reality of the situation. There is no shame in a failed marriage. You can move back into your old room upstairs. We will take care of you." She wanted me small. She wanted me broken, sleeping in my childhood bed, dependent on a family trust she was secretly draining. She thought if she humiliated me enough in front of the extended family, I would shrink away and hand over the keys to my own private accounts. I looked at the empty space where his plate should have been. My pulse beat a slow, steady rhythm against my wrists. I reached into my purse and felt the cold metal edge of my phone, the phone that would soon connect an open line to Julian. "I am perfectly fine right where I am," I told her. Victoria gave a tight, dismissive nod and glided back toward the kitchen to greet more arriving guests. I stood alone in the dining room, holding a glass of cheap wine. The trap was set. The audience was gathering. What my mother did not know was that the only person about to be erased from this family was her. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 4 times, marking the start of the cocktail hour. I stood in the shadow of the dining room archway, the water glass of cheap wine growing warm in my hand. From the parlor, a symphony of forced laughter and clinking ice echoed off the vaulted ceilings. I did not join them right away. I needed to study the battlefield. Victoria operated like a seasoned general. She did not wage war with raised voices or overt insults. She fought with seating arrangements, carefully timed sighs, and weaponized hospitality. I watched her from a distance as she worked the room. She glided between clusters of relatives, a fresh flute of vintage champagne in her hand. Every interaction was a calculated performance. When she approached Uncle Arthur, a man who built a fortune in commercial real estate, her posture shifted. She stood a little taller, her smile adopting a brave, stoic quality. I watched her lean in close, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. I could not hear the exact words over the crackle of the marble fireplace, but I could read the shape of her lips. Julian. Space. Difficult time. Arthur offered a grim nod. his face settling into a mask of grim solidarity. 10 minutes later, she cornered Aunt Margaret by the grand piano. Margaret thrived on scandal. For her, Victoria softened her shoulders, letting a look of maternal exhaustion wash over her features. She pressed a manicured hand to her temple, shaking her head. The performance was flawless. She was portraying the exhausted mother, burdened by the tragic failure of her daughter's marriage. She was planting seeds in fertile soil, knowing Margaret would carry the gossip to every corner of the estate before the turkey was even carved. This was the Whisper campaign. It was an invisible net tightening around me with every passing minute. By the time dinner was served, the entire family would view me through the lens Victoria had carefully ground. I would be the discarded wife, the broken woman, the failure. I took a slow breath and walked back toward the kitchen, seeking a momentary reprieve from the parlor. The kitchen was supposed to be neutral territory. It was not. Sarah stood by the central island, arranging imported cheeses onto a slate board. My brother Lucas sat on a bar stool nearby, his eyes glued to a college football game playing on a small screen mounted beneath the cabinets. Lucas wore a navy cashmere sweater that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He looked comfortable. He always looked comfortable when other people were taking the hits. Sarah glanced up as I entered. She smoothed her perfect blonde hair, her diamond wedding band catching the overhead lights. She married into this family 5 years ago, bringing with her a prestigious Cape Cod pedigree, but very little actual liquidity. Her family's wealth was tied up in historic properties that drained cash rather than producing it. She needed Victoria's approval to fund her current lifestyle. She guarded her position as the favored daughter-in-law with desperate intensity. Isabella, Sarah said. Her voice was too bright, too loud. It grated against the quiet hum of the refrigerator. She reached past a row of chilling Dom Perignon. The vintage bottles sat in a bed of crushed ice, their dark green glass beaded with condensation. She did not reach for one of the Waterford crystal flutes lined up on the counter. Instead, she opened the refrigerator door and pulled out a bottle of white wine from the bottom shelf. It had a screw top. I listened to the harsh metallic crack as she twisted it open. She poured the pale liquid into a standard water glass. She did not offer me a napkin. She just slid it across the marble. "We are keeping things simple for you today," Sarah murmured. "You have enough on your plate without dealing with the good crystal. We know how fragile things are right now." I looked at the water glass. The wine inside smelled sharp, like unripe apples and cheap vinegar. It was an insult delivered with a smile. It was a physical demotion. "Thank you, Sarah," I said. My voice was flat, devoid of the emotional reaction she was hunting for. I picked up the glass. I did not take a sip. Sarah turned back to her cheese board, her shoulders relaxing in victory. She thought she had put me in my place. She thought she was aligning herself with the winning side, but she did not know the truth about the wine. As an estate appraiser, I noticed details other people ignore. I noticed dust patterns where expensive paintings used to hang. I noticed when heirloom rugs are quietly replaced with high-quality replicas. And 3 months ago, I noticed a very specific lot listing in a private auction catalog. The Garcia family possessed a renowned wine cellar. It was a point of pride for my late father. Hundreds of bottles of rare Bordeaux and vintage Burgundy resting in climate-controlled darkness beneath the estate. 3 months ago, that entire collection was auctioned off to an anonymous buyer in London. Victoria had liquidated the cellar to stave off creditors. She sold the family legacy just to cover the interest payments on her hidden loans. The Dom Perignon chilling on the counter was not a symbol of endless wealth. It was a prop. It was a calculated purchase made to maintain the illusion of solvency for a few more hours. She was serving the cheap screw-top wine to the people she felt she no longer needed to impress. Sarah thought the cheap wine was a punishment meant only for me. She did not realize it was a symptom of the very ruin that was about to swallow her own comfortable life. I turned away from the kitchen and walked down the hallway carrying my water glass. I stopped at the entrance to the formal dining room. The space was empty, the guests still lingering over cocktails. The long mahogany table was set with agonizing precision. Bone china plates gleamed under the chandelier. Heavy sterling silver cutlery was aligned perfectly with the edge of the table. Linen napkins stood at attention, folded into intricate peaks. I walked slowly down the length of the room, letting my eyes trace the perimeter of the table. I counted the settings. 1, 2, 3. Down the line, 23. I reached the spot near the drafty bay window. There was a single chair, a single plate. The space beside it, where Julian should have been seated, was a smooth, empty expanse of polished wood. The missing plate was not an oversight. Victoria managed her household staff with ruthless efficiency. The seating chart was a tactical map. By physically erasing my husband from the table, she was making his absence a tangible reality. She was forcing every guest to stare at the empty space, cementing the narrative that I had been abandoned. I ran my fingertips lightly over the edge of the mahogany. The wood felt cold. A normal daughter would have broken down right there. A normal daughter would have confronted her mother, demanded an explanation, or fled out the front door in tears. But I had spent the last 3 years auditing this family. I had paid the property taxes when the trust accounts mysteriously locked up. I had covered the country club dues to keep the rumors at bay. I had funded the illusion. I knew the exact cost of Victoria's pride. I pulled my phone from my pocket. The screen lit up in the dim dining room. A single text message glowed against the dark background. It was from Julian. Logs secured, hitting the highway now. ETA 90 minutes. I did not type a reply. I simply locked the screen and slipped the device back into my pocket. My pulse was slow and steady. The whisper campaign, the cheap wine, the missing plate, they were all pebbles thrown by a woman standing on a crumbling cliff. I took my seat near the drafty window. I placed my water glass next to my single plate. I looked at the 22 other chairs waiting for the family to take their places. I was ready for the dinner to begin. I was ready to watch them eat. Before the catered staff could signal the start of service, Victoria raised her hand and summoned the wandering guests into the grand parlor. I rose from my solitary chair in the dining room, leaving the untouched water glass behind, and followed the trailing edge of the crowd. The parlor was the architectural crown jewel of the Greenwich estate. A towering hearth made of imported Italian marble dominated the far wall, radiating a fierce, dry heat from the crackling birch logs. Above the mantel hung an oil portrait of my grandfather, his stern, painted eyes watching over the room. The space smelled of fresh pine needles, expensive gin, and the faint, dusty scent of old money. It was a room designed to intimidate, built to remind every visitor of the unshakable Garcia legacy. Victoria stood near the center of a hand-woven Persian rug, surrounded by a tight circle of admiring relatives. She was holding court. Her posture was triumphant, her cheeks flushed with the thrill of having an audience. She raised her left arm, pulling back the silk cuff of her emerald dress, and extended her wrist toward the warm glow of the fire. A collective gasp of appreciation murmured through the cluster of aunts and cousins. Encircling her wrist was a thick, dazzling tennis bracelet. Dozens of large, clear stones caught the light of the chandelier in the fire, throwing brilliant sparks across the wood-paneled walls. "A little reward for myself," Victoria announced. Her voice was loud enough to carry over the crackling logs. I authorized a minor disbursement from the family trust this week. Our portfolio managers had a stellar quarter, and I felt it was time to celebrate our enduring stability. Aunt Margaret leaned in, her eyes wide with undisguised envy. "It is stunning, Victoria. The clarity is remarkable." Sarah, standing just over my mother's shoulder, let out a soft, fawning sigh. "Only the best for the matriarch of the family," she cooed, her eyes practically locked onto the glittering stones. Lucas stood silently beside his wife, offering a tight, approving nod. He did not question how a trust fund that supposedly could not cover his sister's college tuition 10 years ago was suddenly generating enough surplus cash for six-figure jewelry. He merely accepted the narrative that kept him comfortable. I stood on the fringe of the circle watching the performance. The family trust. It was the mythical engine of the Garcia wealth, the sacred account that Victoria guarded with paranoid intensity. She invoked its name to project financial invulnerability, but I knew the actual numbers. I knew the trust was a hollow shell, drained by years of hidden debts, leveraged to the brink of collapse. There were no stellar quarters. There was only mounting panic. My profession requires a clinical detachment from sentimentality. My firm pays me a substantial salary to walk into gilded rooms and tell grieving widows that their late husband's prized art collection consists of high-end reproductions. I am trained to look past the velvet ropes and the polished surfaces. I carry the tools of my trade everywhere, a habit forged by years of unexpected discoveries in dusty attics and shadowy estate sales. I slipped my hand into the side pocket of my leather purse. My fingers brushed against the familiar, brushed steel casing of my pocket jeweler's loop. It was a small, heavy instrument designed to magnify the hidden truths of the world by a factor of 10. I stepped forward, breaking the invisible boundary of the admiring circle. The chatter died down as the relatives noticed my approach. They expected me to remain in the shadows, nursing my supposed heartbreak. My sudden presence threw off the rhythm of the room. "May I see it, Mother?" I asked. My voice was calm, a stark contrast to the buzzing energy of the parlor. Victoria's triumphant smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but she quickly recovered. She thought I was stepping forward to bend the knee to pay homage to her wealth in front of the family. She thought my request was an act of submission. "Of course, Isabella," she purred. She extended her wrist toward me, her chin lifting in arrogant defiance. "You always did appreciate the finer things, even if you could never quite hold on to them." A few cousins exchanged uncomfortable glances at the veiled insult, but no one intervened. I reached out and gently took her hand. Her skin was warm from the fire, her pulse thumping a rapid, confident rhythm against my fingertips. With my free hand, I pulled the steel loop from my pocket. I flipped the protective casing open with my thumb, the hinge locking into place with a satisfying metallic click. Victoria's confident pulse skipped a beat. Her eyes darted to the small metal instrument in my hand. "What are you doing?" she asked, the honeyed tone of her voice tightening into something brittle. "Just admiring the clarity," I replied softly. I brought her wrist up closer to my face, ignoring her sudden rigidity. I pressed the edge of the loop against my orbital bone and leaned in. The world outside the lens vanished, replaced by the magnified geometry of the nearest stone. A natural diamond draws light down into its depths, returning a sharp, icy brilliance. It is a singular, unforgiving reflection. The stone under my lens did not do that. As the firelight hit the facets, the gem fractured the light, throwing a chaotic disco ball spray of rainbow dispersion. I adjusted the angle, looking through the crown of the stone toward the pavilion facets. There it was, the telltale sign, facet doubling. The lines of the lower cuts appeared blurred and duplicated, an optical illusion impossible in a singly refractive diamond. It was a beautiful piece of chemistry, grown in a laboratory, but it was not a diamond. It was silicon carbide. It was an imposter. I folded the loop shut. The sharp click seemed to echo in the sudden quiet of the parlor. I did not announce my findings to the room. I did not need to perform for the audience. I leaned forward, my face mere inches from hers, crossing the boundary of personal space. "High-grade moissanite," I whispered. My voice was barely a breath, meant only for her ears. Did the jeweler know? Or did you? Victoria yanked her arm back as if I had pressed a branding iron to her skin. She stumbled backward a half step, the heel of her shoe catching on the thick pile of the Persian rug. The color vanished from her face, leaving her skin a pale ashen white. Her chest heaved, and for one unguarded second, the mask of the untouchable matriarch shattered. Her eyes were wide, frantic, locking onto mine with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. She opened her mouth to speak, to deliver a sharp reprimand, but no words came out. Her throat worked silently. The relatives surrounding us shifted in confusion, unable to hear the whispered exchange, but clearly witnessing the sudden, visceral panic seizing their host. "Is everything all right?" Aunt Margaret asked, her brow furrowing with concern. Victoria swallowed hard, her hand flying up to cover the glittering, fraudulent stones on her wrist. "Yes!" she snapped, her voice shrill and breathless. "Yes! Isabella was just admiring the setting. "It is time to sit down. Everyone to the dining room, now." She turned on her heel and practically fled toward the arched doorway, leaving her admiring court bewildered in her wake. I remained standing on the rug, slipping the loop back into my purse. The interaction had taken less than a minute, but the balance of power in the house had irrevocably shifted. Victoria had realized the fatal flaw in her plan. She had constructed a narrative of endless wealth and a broken, discarded daughter. But the daughter she was trying to break was standing in her parlor, peering through a magnifying glass, dismantling the illusion stone by fake stone. If I could identify the fraudulent jewelry, she knew I could eventually identify the fraudulent bank statements. The terror I saw in her eyes was not just about the embarrassment of wearing fake diamonds. It was the terror of exposure. She realized I was not a passive victim waiting to be rescued. I was a threat. I walked slowly out of the parlor, following the whispering crowd toward the dining room. The tension in the air had thickened, turning heavy and electric. Victoria's timeline had just accelerated. She could no longer drag out her cruel games over dessert and coffee. She needed to discredit me, to destroy my reputation in front of these witnesses before I could open my mouth and expose the financial rot eroding the ground beneath their feet. She had to strike first, and she had to strike hard. And as I took my solitary seat by the drafty window, my phone buzzed lightly in my pocket, signaling that my own trap was ready to snap shut. The scrape of wooden chair legs against the hardwood floor signaled the migration from the parlor. 22 guests filtered into the dining room, their voices dropping to hushed, respectful registers as they navigated the perimeter of the grand mahogany table. I remained in my seat near the drafty bay window, an island of stillness amidst the rustling silk and heavy wool suits. They took their assigned places with agonizing slowness. I watched their eyes dart toward me, linger for a fraction of a second on the empty expanse of wood where Julian's plate should have been, and quickly dart away. The air grew thick with unspoken judgments. I could feel the weight of their collective pity pressing against my shoulders. It was a suffocating physical presence in the room. Sitting through this charade required a very specific type of endurance. Anyone observing my silence might have mistaken it for the paralysis of a broken woman. They would wonder why a successful estate appraiser, someone who negotiated with ruthless auction houses and guarded wealthy clients from fraud, would simply sit there and absorb the humiliation. If I knew my mother was wearing synthetic glass and peddling lies about my marriage, why did I wait for the Thanksgiving turkey to be carved before fighting back? The answer resided in the intricate machinery of the American legal system.
Revenge is a messy, unpredictable emotion. An audit is a precise surgical procedure. Julian and I were conducting an audit.
My husband is a digital security architect. He spends his professional life cracking encrypted servers and tracing invisible financial footprints across international borders. 14 days ago, sitting in our home office with the glow of 3 monitors illuminating his face, Julian breached the firewall Victoria had paid a discount firm to build around her private trust accounts. He found the rot within hours. He traced the missing vintage wine collection. He tracked the diverted trust disbursements. He uncovered the shell companies she created to funnel money into her own checking account to maintain the Greenwich facade. I wanted to drive to this estate that very night. I wanted to kick the front doors open, throw the printed spreadsheets onto the marble foyer, and demand the truth. My chest had burned with the sharp, acidic sting of betrayal. But Julian placed a steady hand over mine and stopped me. He showed me the pending transactions. Victoria had not just drained the liquid assets, she had crossed a fatal legal boundary. She had submitted forged paperwork to the county clerk, attempting to leverage the estate itself by taking out quiet secondary liens against the property. Bureaucracy moves at a glacial pace. The county clerk office required exactly 14 days to process those specific property liens and stamp them into the public record. If we confronted her 2 weeks ago, the paperwork would have remained pending. She could have claimed it was a clerical error, withdrawn the applications, and swept the forgery under the rug. She would have played the victim, twisting the narrative to make us look like paranoid, ungrateful children. We needed the ink to dry. We needed the state of Connecticut to officially record her fraud. That deadline fell on the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. Furthermore, there was the issue of Julian's own reputation. Victoria had not just stolen money. She had actively begun destroying my husband's character to cover her tracks. She had fabricated a phantom mistress. She had drafted a narrative of infidelity to explain his sudden absence from family functions, ensuring no one would question why the forensic accountant was suddenly banned from the estate. A defamation suit requires demonstrable damages. Whispering rumors to a few neighbors over coffee is difficult to prove in court. But standing at the head of a formal dining table, raising a glass, and stating a fabricated, character-destroying lie on the record in front of 22 prominent character witnesses presents a different reality entirely. That is actionable. That is the gold standard of slander. We needed an audience. We needed her to feel so confident, so untouchable, that she would broadcast her lies to the entire extended family. Every side eye I received from a cousin, every patronizing smile from an aunt, was a necessary, agonizing step toward sealing her legal fate. I was not enduring their pity out of weakness. I was enduring it out of strategy. I sat in the drafty corner, wrapping myself in the cold restraint of a professional investigator, watching my relatives gleefully assemble the gallows they were about to swing from. Cousin David pulled out the chair to my left. He sat down, heavily adjusting the lapels of his tailored suit. He cleared his throat, searching for a safe topic of conversation. The traffic on the interstate was dreadful coming up from the city, David murmured, staring firmly at the salt and pepper shakers in the center of the table. I suppose the holiday rush is unavoidable. It is, I replied, my voice smooth and untroubled. People are always rushing towards something they cannot control. David gave a nervous, shallow laugh. He glanced at the empty space to my right. He wanted to ask. The curiosity was practically vibrating off his skin. Victoria had primed him with the story of the broken marriage, but human nature demands the gory details. "Are you managing all right, Isabella?" he asked, lowering his voice into a tone usually reserved for funerals. "I know the holidays can magnify certain absences." I turned my head and looked at him directly. I studied the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead. He did not actually care about my well-being. He wanted a reaction. He wanted a tear, a sigh, a confession he could carry back to his wife on the drive home. "I am managing perfectly, David. Clarity is a wonderful gift. Sometimes you have to let the dead wood burn to see the forest." He blinked, unsettled by the lack of sorrow in my eyes. He reached for his water glass, suddenly eager to end the interaction. Across the table, Aunt Margaret leaned forward. Her neck was adorned with pearls that clacked against the edge of her porcelain soup bowl. She possessed a talent for delivering venom wrapped in Southern charm. You know, Isabella Margaret projected her voice so it carried over the ambient chatter. My dear friend Helen went through a similar transition last year. Her husband stepped out on her too. She found that taking up a hobby really helped fill the empty hours. Have you considered pottery? It is wonderfully grounding for the hands. The conversations around us dimmed. Several relatives paused with their forks halfway to their mouths, waiting to see if the wounded animal would snap. I smiled at Margaret. It was a terrifyingly calm expression. "I appreciate the advice, Margaret," I said, "but my hands are quite full at the moment. I have been doing a lot of auditing lately. You would be surprised what you find buried in the fine print when you start looking closely." Margaret stiffened. The pearls stopped moving. She did not understand the threat, but she recognized the predator in my tone. She offered a tight, dismissive nod and turned her attention to her bread plate. I let my gaze sweep over the room. Sarah was whispering something to Lucas, her blonde head tilted toward his ear. Lucas kept his eyes trained on the linen tablecloth, his jaw clenched tight. They were comfortable in their ignorance. They believed the hierarchy of the family was secure, with Victoria safely at the top, dispensing favors and funding their illusions. The first course arrived. Servers in crisp white shirts moved silently around the perimeter, placing steaming bowls of roasted butternut squash soup in front of the guests. The scent of sage and brown butter filled the room, a rich, comforting aroma that starkly contrasted the toxic energy humming beneath the surface. Victoria took her seat at the head of the table. She smoothed the napkin over her lap, her fake diamond bracelet catching the light of the chandelier. Her face was still slightly flushed from our interaction in the parlor, but the terror had been replaced by a hardened, desperate resolve. She picked up her heavy silver spoon. The Whisper Network had done its job. The audience was primed. The stage was set. I reached into my pocket and retrieved my smartphone. I placed it face up on the tablecloth, right next to the rim of my soup bowl. The screen was dark, blending into the shadows of the room. It looked like a casual, careless gesture. It was anything but. I rested my hands in my lap and waited for my mother to speak. I knew the performance was about to begin, and I wanted to make sure my husband heard every single word. The geography of a formal dining table is never accidental. Every chair is a negotiated territory. Every inch of mahogany signifies rank within the family hierarchy. Victoria claimed the head of the table, flanked immediately by Lucas and Sarah. They formed a tight triangle of perceived power, hoarding the warmth of the room and the attention of the serving staff. My placement was a deliberate exile. I sat at the furthest possible point from the matriarch. My chair was wedged against a bay window featuring original single-pane glass. A bitter Connecticut wind howled outside, seeping through the aging wooden frames and brushing a persistent chill against my neck. In my mother's calculations, the physical distance mirrored my social demotion. I was no longer an inner circle confidant. I was a cautionary tale, relegated to the drafty margins. Aunt Margaret, seated diagonally from me, shot a disapproving glare at the black rectangle of my smartphone resting on the pristine white linen. In this house, placing a device on the dinner table was considered a severe breach of etiquette. It implied distraction. It suggested the company was inadequate. I ignored her silent reprimand. The screen remained dark, giving the illusion of a sleeping device. Yet beneath that darkened glass, a silent digital tether stretched out into the freezing night. The microphone was live. The call had been connected 10 minutes prior. Somewhere beyond the frosted window panes parked down the winding gravel driveway, Julian sat in the driver's seat of our sedan. The engine idled softly to keep the heater running. I could picture him perfectly. He wore his tailored wool overcoat, a steaming cup of dark roast coffee resting in the center console. Through the vehicle speakers, the ambient noise of the dining room piped directly into the quiet cabin of his car. He could hear the clinking of silver spoons against porcelain. He could hear the soft, pretentious hum of Vivaldi playing through the hidden sound system. And most importantly, he could hear every syllable my mother uttered. This open line was not an act of cowardice. It was our standard operating procedure. Julian and I built our marriage on the premise of joint strategy. When his digital security firm faced a hostile corporate takeover 2 years ago, I sat in the adjoining room analyzing the opponent's real estate assets to find leverage. When I faced a difficult appraisal for a combative heir, he pulled the hidden digital metadata on the contested artworks. We did not face threats alone. While I sat physically isolated in a drafty chair, absorbing the venom of 24 relatives, my partner was holding the other end of the rope. I was not a discarded wife. I was the inside operative. Victoria picked up her soup spoon, but before taking a sip, she fixed her gaze on me. She pitched her voice to easily carry over the length of the table. "Isabella, darling," she called out. The honeyed tone was back, thick and cloying. "I do hope you are comfortable down there. We intentionally put you in that seat so you would not feel overwhelmed by the conversation tonight. We know you need a quiet corner to process everything you are going through." The room fell silent again. The relatives waited, their spoons hovering over their butternut squash soup. It was a masterclass in weaponized pity. By framing my isolation as an act of maternal mercy, she made any complaint on my part look ungrateful. She expected me to lower my eyes and whisper a meek word of thanks. Instead, I kept my spine straight. I looked past the intervening relatives, past Sarah's smug face, and met my mother's eyes. "I am perfectly fine, Mother," I replied, ensuring my voice was crisp and resonant enough for the phone microphone to capture every inflection. "The view from this corner is highly educational. You see the entire room differently when you step away from the center. You notice the drafts. You notice where the insulation is failing." Victoria's smile tightened. A brief, uncertain shadow crossed her features. She did not like the metaphor. It struck too close to the truth of her crumbling estate. Well, she managed, taking a small, delicate sip of her soup. "We just want you to feel secure. Safety is the most important thing family can provide." I glanced at my phone. I knew Julianne was sitting in the cold car listening to the woman who forged documents and drained trust funds preach about providing safety. I could almost hear his dry, humorless chuckle. The dramatic irony was a potent, intoxicating force. The villain was delivering a soliloquy on a stage rigged with hidden microphones, performing for an audience that included her ultimate judge. The dinner service progressed, the staff clearing the soup bowls and bringing out the main courses. Platters of roasted turkey glazed root vegetables and wild mushroom stuffing circulated. Sarah eagerly took control of the conversation at the dominant end of the table. "Lucas and I are looking at a summer property in Nantucket," Sarah announced, serving herself a generous portion of stuffing. "Nothing too grand, just a historic salt box near the water. The Cape is wonderful, but we feel it is time to expand our portfolio. Do you not agree, Victoria?" Victoria offered a stiff nod. "A brilliant idea, Sarah. Real estate is the only true bedrock of wealth." I cut a small piece of turkey, chewing methodically. Sarah was boasting about expanding a portfolio funded by an irrevocable trust that no longer existed. She was sketching floor plans for a Nantucket vacation home, while the chair she sat in was secretly mortgaged to a predatory lender. Lucas nodded along with his wife, his jaw relaxed, his ignorance profound. He had spent his entire adulthood letting his mother manage his financial reality. He traded independence for convenience, and tonight, the bill for that convenience was coming due. Listening to their hollow bragging required an immense amount of self-control. I wanted to lean across the table and ask Sarah how she planned to finance a beachfront property with empty ledgers. I wanted to ask Lucas if he knew his own signature had been forged on secondary loan applications. But the timeline dictated patience. Julian needed Victoria to escalate. He needed her to bring up the fabricated mistress again, this time with explicit detail, to solidify the legal threshold for defamation. Until she laid out the lies, I had to keep the audience focused. I took a sip of my water. The conversation shifted toward the upcoming winter charity galas. Aunt Margaret began listing the various host committees she had joined. The mundane chatter grated against my nerves. The adrenaline I had been suppressing since I walked through the front doors began to seep into my bloodstream. My profession trains me to handle stress. When evaluating a contested estate, I often stand in rooms filled with grieving, angry heirs, calmly pointing out that a beloved grandfather's prized antique desk is a cheap 20th century reproduction. I am accustomed to managing volatile emotions. But those are strangers. Sitting across from the people who raised me, listening to them orchestrate my social execution, demanded a different kind of stamina. The prolonged exposure to their toxic theater started to manifest physically. A faint tremor began in my fingertips. It was not sorrow. It was the physical byproduct of holding back an overwhelming tide of cold, calculated rage. I needed a moment to recalibrate. I needed to send a signal to Julian without speaking a word. I carefully set my fork down. I let my hands rest on the table, allowing the slight tremor to be visible to anyone looking closely. Cousin David, seated to my left, noticed the vibration. His eyes widened slightly. He nudged his wife under the table. The Whisper Network silently hummed to life, interpreting my trembling hands as the long-awaited breakdown. I took a shallow, shaky breath, playing directly into their expectations. The trap was ready for the next phase. My mother needed to believe she was winning. She needed to see me crack. The open line sitting on the tablecloth had captured the prelude. Now I had to set the stage for the main event. The tremor in my fingers began as a subtle vibration in the tips of my nails, but within seconds it propagated through my entire hand, causing the silver fork to dance against the china plate with a rhythmic, sharp clicking sound. It was the kind of involuntary reaction that people expect from a woman whose marriage has been publicly incinerated over a dinner of butternut squash soup. I let my breath hitch. I allowed my eyelids to flutter, casting my gaze down toward the tablecloth, effectively hiding the lack of genuine panic in my pupils. The performance of a wounded creature is an art form, and I had been observing my mother's stagecraft for 3 decades. I knew exactly how to make the room believe I was drowning. Victoria watched me with the predatory patience of a hawk tracking a field mouse. She did not miss a single twitch of my muscles or the way I clutched my napkin. Across the table, Sarah tilted her head, her lips pressed into a thin, synthetic line of compassion that barely masked her internal glee. They were both waiting for the collapse. They were savoring the moment the foundation of my composure finally gave way, convinced that the weight of their scrutiny had succeeded in crushing my spirit. I pushed my chair back with a jagged, uneven motion, the legs screeching against the polished hardwood. The sound was harsh, an ugly intrusion on the refined atmosphere of the room. I stood up too quickly, my knees catching the edge of the mahogany table, causing my water glass to slosh dangerously near the rim. I did not look at anyone. I kept my head bowed, shielding my face with a curtain of dark hair, and hurried away from the table, my footsteps uneven and frantic. Behind me, the dining room descended into a flurry of stifled murmurs. I heard Victoria lean toward Sarah, her voice a low, triumphant hiss that cut through the silence of the room. She was reveling in the victory. She believed she had stripped me of my armor and sent me scurrying away to hide my tears. Every step I took down the hallway felt like a heavy stone placed on the scale of her arrogance. I reached the guest bathroom near the foyer, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. The air in the small room was cool, scented with expensive lavender soap and lemon polish. I threw the heavy brass bolt, the sound of the locking mechanism ringing out with satisfying finality. The moment the lock clicked into place, the mask vanished. My posture, which had been slumped and fragile in the dining room, straightened instantly. The frantic, jagged rhythm of my breathing slowed into a smooth, deliberate flow. I moved to the mirror, but I did not look for the face of a broken daughter. I looked for the eyes of an operative. My reflection was composed, the jawline set in a hard, determined line. The trembling in my hands had stopped, as if it were a physical switch I had turned off. I reached into the small, structured clutch I had carried in my pocket and pulled out a slim, high-end tablet. It was not a device for browsing or social media. It was an encrypted terminal, a secondary link to the network Julian and I had established to map the estate. I tapped the screen, the display waking to reveal a dark interface filled with scrolling lines of data and real-time network traffic. I held the tablet up, connecting to the estate's private Wi-Fi node. The signal strength fluctuated, struggling against the thick, historic plaster walls of the mansion, but it eventually locked on. I began the diagnostic sequence. I needed to ping the router. I needed to confirm that the handshake between Julian's remote audit software and the home server was still active. My phone, sitting on the dining room table amidst the silverware and the gossip, was currently functioning as a high-fidelity remote microphone, streaming the dinner conversation directly to Julian's car. But I needed the tablet to verify the data transfer. I needed to be sure that the files, the mortgage records, the wire transfers, the proof of the shell companies, were successfully uploading to the cloud. The screen flashed green. A string of IP addresses danced across the glass, confirming the connection. Julian was not just listening. He was actively pulling the final architectural files of the family trust from the estate's local backup drive. He was scrubbing the digital floor, leaving no room for Victoria to claim later that these documents were doctored. This was the end game. I watched the progress bar inch forward. 80%, 85%, 90. I leaned against the cool porcelain of the vanity, my gaze fixed on the scrolling text. This was the true nature of my family's reality. For years, I had walked through these halls thinking I was protecting our legacy, believing that the prestige of the Garcia name was an objective fact. I had played the part of the dutiful, appraising daughter, meticulously documenting the value of our estates while ignoring the rot in our own foundation. I had spent my life applying professional rigor to the belongings of strangers while refusing to apply the same skepticism to the people who raised me. The progress bar hit 100%. The connection blinked, signaling a successful transfer. I tucked the tablet back into my clutch, the weight of the device a comfort against my hip. The audit was complete. The digital ledger was locked in the cloud, beyond Victoria's reach, beyond her ability to delete or manipulate. I turned to the sink and turned on the faucet. I splashed cold, bracing water onto my face, feeling the shock of the temperature hit my skin and refresh my focus. I picked up a silk towel and patted my face dry, careful not to disturb the subtle makeup I had applied hours ago. I reached for my lipstick, a deep, muted crimson that signaled strength and indifference, and applied it with clinical precision. I did not need to be pretty. I needed to be accurate. I needed to be the force that held the standard for the truth. I leaned back toward the mirror, staring into my own eyes. I was no longer the prey. The dynamics of the evening had shifted irrevocably. The predator, who had spent her life hunting my confidence, was now standing at the head of a dinner table, surrounded by an audience of her own making, utterly unaware that the ground beneath her had already been hollowed out. I straightened my dress, smoothing the fabric over my hips, ensuring there was not a single wrinkle out of place. I checked the lock again, letting the silence of the room settle in my chest, a deep reservoir of calm that I would carry back to the dining room. When I opened the bathroom door, I did not hurry. I walked back down the hallway with a rhythmic, measured gait. I could hear the muffled, pretentious chatter of the guests swelling in volume as I approached the dining room archway. They were still talking about the summer properties and the charity gala calendars, blissfully ignorant of the fact that the life they were describing was already a historical artifact. I stopped at the threshold of the dining room. Victoria had returned to her monologue, holding her glass aloft again, perhaps launching into a new anecdote about my supposed instability. She was confident, radiant, and completely exposed. She had no idea the microphone on the table was capturing every vibration of her voice. She had no idea the ledger was closed. I took a deep breath, the scent of the roasted turkey and the sharp metallic tang of the cheap wine greeting me. I stepped back into the arena. As I neared my chair, Victoria stopped mid-sentence. She looked at me, her eyes sweeping over my face, searching for the telltale signs of a breakdown. She wanted to see red, swollen eyes and a trembling chin. She wanted to see the evidence of her successful psychological strike. I gave her nothing of the sort. I walked past her gaze as if she were a piece of furniture. I pulled out my chair with steady, firm hands and sat down. I smoothed my napkin across my lap, straightened my silverware, and looked directly across the table at Sarah. Sarah was still holding the bottle of cheap wine, her hand hovering over a glass. She looked at me, waiting for me to be ashamed of my return, waiting for me to apologize for the scene. I picked up the screw-top bottle from the table in front of her. I did not ask for permission. I held it up, inspecting the label with the same professional intensity I applied to an 18th century mahogany armoire. "This is a fascinating vintage, Sarah," I said, my voice cutting through the room with crystal clarity. "It has a remarkably sharp finish, quite distinctive for such a mass-produced label." The silence that followed was different from the one before. It was not the silence of pity. It was the silence of a room where someone has just realized they are standing on a grenade. Sarah dropped the bottle onto the tablecloth with a dull thud. Her face turned a patchy, uneven shade of red. Victoria gripped her fork so hard her knuckles turned white, her eyes darting toward me, searching for the threat behind my words. I picked up my own wine glass, took a slow, deliberate sip of the vinegar-tasting liquid, and let a small, enigmatic smile play across my lips. The audit was not just beginning. It had already started, and I was the only person in the room who knew exactly how long the dinner would last. The tension in the dining room hung thick and heavy, a palpable force pressing against the antique wallpaper. My comment regarding the cheap wine had momentarily disrupted Victoria's rhythm. I watched the gears turning behind her eyes. A woman who rules by maintaining an illusion of perfection cannot let a subtle challenge go unanswered. She needed to reclaim the high ground. She needed to plunge the knife deeper to ensure the audience remembered who held the power. Victoria set her fork down with deliberate slowness. She blotted her lips with her linen napkin, her gaze fixed entirely on me. The ambient chatter around the table died away instantly. Everyone recognized the shift in her posture. The predator was preparing to strike. Isabella Victoria said. Her voice adopted a tone of profound, suffocated grief. It was an award-winning delivery. I know you are trying to project strength tonight. I applaud your bravery. But wearing a mask will not heal the deep wounds you are carrying. We are your family. You do not have to pretend the betrayal did not happen. She paused, letting the word betrayal echo across the expensive china. Cousin David shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Aunt Margaret leaned in, her eyes wide with eager anticipation. I thought we agreed to keep the details private, Victoria continued, directing her tragic sigh toward the rest of the guests. But since Isabella is determined to put on a brave face, I feel we must confront reality. True healing requires honesty. Victoria clasped her hands together, resting them on the edge of the mahogany table. 2 weeks ago, I stopped by Isabella's home to drop off a floral arrangement. Julian was supposedly away on a business trip. While I was waiting in the foyer, I accidentally brushed against his heavy winter overcoat hanging on the rack. A piece of paper fluttered to the floor. The entire room held its breath. The silence was absolute. I bent down to retrieve it, Victoria said, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. It was a receipt from the Beaumont Hotel downtown. It was dated for a Tuesday afternoon, and when I picked it up, the collar of his coat was radiating the scent of cheap floral perfume, not the elegant fragrance my daughter wears, something harsh, something hidden. She looked back at me, her eyes brimming with synthetic sorrow. I am so sorry, darling. I know you wanted to believe his excuses, but a hotel receipt in the middle of the workday is impossible to misinterpret. I let my shoulders slump. I brought my hands up, gripping the edge of the table, as if trying to anchor myself against a rising tide. I allowed my lower lip to tremble just a fraction. Mother, please, I stammered, letting my voice crack and pitch upward. We talked about this. Julian explained that receipt. He was meeting a client in the hotel lobby. He was working in a private suite, Isabella Victoria countered, her tone firming into authoritative pity. You have always been far too trusting. You must stop protecting a man who treats his vows with such careless disregard. I looked down at my lap, blinking rapidly as if fighting back a flood of tears. I let out a jagged, uneven breath. No, I whispered, my voice barely audible. You are wrong. You do not understand. My stammering, my downcast eyes, my trembling voice. It was all a carefully calibrated performance, and Victoria fell for it, blindly. She mistook my calculated retreat for total surrender. She sat taller in her chair, radiating the smug, intoxicating glow of a victor who has just vanquished her only rival. As I stared at the intricate weave of my linen napkin, the cruelty of her performance washed over me. It was a familiar cruelty. She had spent my entire life using public spectacle to mask her own private sins. Playing the stammering victim in the present transported my mind backward, pulling a specific, pivotal memory from the depths of my adolescence. I was 18 years old. It was a humid Tuesday afternoon in August. The Greenwich house was suffocatingly quiet because Victoria had dismissed the housekeeping staff for the week, claiming they needed a sudden vacation. I had walked into her home office looking for a postage stamp. Instead, I found a thick envelope with stark red lettering shoved hastily underneath a stack of glossy architectural magazines. It was a formal notice of default from the county tax assessor. The property taxes on the estate were severely delinquent. The document threatened immediate lien and public auction if the balance was not cured within 10 days. The fear that seized my 18-year-old chest was paralyzing. I had grown up believing the Garcia legacy was an immovable fortress. Standing in that quiet office holding the harsh reality printed on cheap government paper, the fortress dissolved into a mirage. I realized my mother was steering our family toward a cliff while demanding everyone admire the view. My late grandfather had established a modest college savings account in my name. It was not tied to Victoria's primary trust. It was the only liquid asset I actually controlled. That afternoon, I drove to the local bank branch. I sat across from a loan officer, my hands shaking, and authorized the liquidation of my entire educational future. I requested a certified cashier's check made payable to the county tax collector. I signed the transfer papers, watching the balance of my account drop to zero. I became the secret financial savior of the family that very day. I carried the heavy, unacknowledged burden of keeping the lights on, while the matriarch pretended the sun never set. I returned to the estate and sat on the stone steps of the front porch, feeling a hollow, terrifying ache in my stomach. 30 minutes later, the crunch of gravel echoed up the long driveway. Victoria pulled up to the house in a brand-new silver Mercedes sedan. The dealer tags were still flapping against the rear bumper. She stepped out of the luxury vehicle wearing oversized designer sunglasses and a vibrant silk scarf. She tossed her keys to me with a brilliant, carefree smile. "Do you like it, Isabella?" she asked, running her hand along the sleek hood. I decided we needed a little upgrade. The universe always rewards those who expect the best. You just have to project prosperity, darling. I looked at the silver car. I thought about the cashier's check sitting in my pocket, the check that saved the very driveway she was parked on. I realized in that singular, defining moment that Victoria did not inhabit reality. She inhabited a fantasy, and she was perfectly willing to bleed anyone dry to fund her illusions. That was the afternoon I became an appraiser of my own family. That was the day I started keeping the hidden ledger, documenting every diversion, every lie, every missing dollar. I understood that the only way to survive her delusions was to hold the objective proof. The memory faded, bringing the sounds of the dining room back into sharp focus. The clink of silverware, the low, uncomfortable murmurs of the guests. I raised my head slowly, keeping my expression fragile and defeated. Victoria was looking at me with an expression of supreme satisfaction. She had aired the dirty laundry. She had presented her fabricated evidence to the jury. She believed she had painted me into a corner from which I could never escape. By playing the stammering, heartbroken wife, I had lulled her into a false sense of absolute invincibility. She thought my silence was the white flag of a conquered enemy. She glanced at Sarah, who returned a sycophantic smile. Lucas was staring at his water goblet, his jaw tight, choosing the path of least resistance. The enablers were aligned. The audience was captivated. Victoria felt the intoxicating rush of total control. She decided it was time for the final act. She wanted to formalize her victory. She wanted to deliver the killing blow while the room was still vibrating with the shock of her revelation. Victoria pushed her chair back, the wood scraping loudly against the floorboards. She stood up, smoothing the front of her emerald dress. She reached across the table, her synthetic diamonds flashing under the chandelier, and picked up her heavy sterling silver spoon. She turned toward her crystal champagne flute. She did not know the IP addresses had finished downloading. She did not know the open line on the table was broadcasting her impending downfall to the man waiting in the driveway. She only knew she felt powerful. She raised the silver spoon. She prepared to tap the glass. The end was beginning. The sharp metallic ping of a silver spoon striking crystal cut through the remaining ambient chatter. The sound was crisp, and it demanded immediate obedience. 22 heads turned toward the head of the table. Victoria stood bathed in the warm golden glow of the tiered chandelier. She held her champagne flute aloft. The facets of the delicate glass fractured the light across the dark wood wainscoting. She let the quiet stretch over the dining room. She ensured every aunt, cousin, and extended in-law had their attention firmly anchored to her before she arranged her features into a mask of theatrical sorrow. Family Victoria began. Her voice carried a fragile, artificial tremor. Thanksgiving is about holding our loved ones close. It is about offering a sanctuary when the world outside becomes unforgiving, especially when one of our own is hurting. She turned her gaze down the length of the long mahogany table. She locked eyes with me. I sat near the drafty bay window, my hands resting lightly in my lap. I felt the cold air seeping through the old glass pane, chilling my shoulders. As many of you are already aware, our dear Isabella is navigating a terrible transition, Victoria continued. She projected her words so they bounced off the walls and reached every corner of the room. Julian has chosen to leave her. He has found another woman. A unified intake of breath swept through the room. It was the sound of 22 people simultaneously registering a scandal. Relatives I had not spoken to since the previous holiday stared at me. Their expressions held a sickening blend of pity and quiet superiority. The public execution was underway. This was a shaming designed to strip away my dignity. It was a calculated performance meant to end with me relying on my mother's controlling grace. Victoria lowered her glass just a fraction. She pressed her free hand over her heart, simulating a mother's profound heartbreak. "We are heartbroken by his betrayal," she added, her tone thick with manufactured grief. "But this family will always be a safety net for her. We will protect our own." The room went dead silent. The stillness was heavy and suffocating. No one reached for their water goblets. No one picked up a fork. The only sound was the faint crackle of the birch logs burning in the distant parlor fireplace. Every eye shifted from Victoria down to my isolated chair at the far end of the table. They were waiting for the inevitable. They expected me to burst into tears. They anticipated the trembling lip, the choked sob, the hasty retreat out the front doors. I did not move. I maintained my posture, keeping my spine perfectly aligned against the back of the wooden chair. A few seats away, Sarah swirled the cheap wine in her water glass. The corner of her mouth twitched upward in a suppressed smirk. She relished the spectacle. For Sarah, my demotion meant her elevation. As long as I was the broken daughter, she remained the favored in-law. She thrived on the unspoken hierarchy of the estate, viewing my fabricated failure as a validation of her own choices. Beside her sat my brother. Lucas studied his half-eaten plate of butternut squash soup as if the orange liquid held the secrets of the universe. He refused to look in my direction. He is the golden child, the son who spent his entire life avoiding friction. Choosing to defend his sister would mean challenging the matriarch. It would mean risking his comfortable allowance and his future inheritance. He chose his own comfort over protecting me. His passive silence was just as damaging as my mother's spoken lies. The silence stretched further, turning the dining room into a psychological pressure cooker. I could feel the collective weight of their stares. It was an invasive, probing sensation. They were dissecting my worth based on a lie they swallowed without a single question. Victoria remained standing. She expected her words to act as a physical blow. She wanted me to feel so isolated and humiliated that I would have no choice but to crawl back into her sphere of influence. This is the nature of toxic charity. She creates the wound in public so she can offer the bandage in public, securing a lifetime of subservient gratitude. But she miscalculated. She assumed my silence earlier was a sign of weakness. She believed my stammering over the hotel receipt was a genuine admission of defeat. She did not realize she was performing a play that had already been canceled. I let my gaze drift down to the black rectangle of my smartphone resting on the white linen tablecloth. The screen remained dark. To the rest of the room, it was just a piece of neglected technology. But I knew the microphone was live. I knew the connection was pristine. Julian was sitting in the idling car at the end of the gravel driveway. He had heard the clink of the silver spoon. He had heard the tremor in Victoria's voice. He had heard her state clearly and definitively that he abandoned his marriage for another woman. The legal threshold for defamation had just been crossed. The slander was now a matter of public record, witnessed by 24 prominent members of the community. My mother had just handed us the final piece of ammunition we required. The guests continued to stare. Cousin David shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting between me and the matriarch. Aunt Margaret tightened her grip on her pearl necklace, her mouth open in a silent shape of shock. They were all waiting for my response. They were waiting for me to break. I felt a strange, profound sense of liberation wash over me. For 32 years, I had navigated the treacherous waters of the Garcia family dynamics. I had walked on eggshells to preserve the illusion of peace. I had paid debts that were not mine. I had absorbed insults to keep the surface of the water calm. I had let my mother move my place setting to the margins of her life, treating me like a piece of furniture she could rearrange at will. That era ended right here near the drafty bay window. The relatives seated around the mahogany table were not just passive observers. They were active participants in the ecosystem Victoria had cultivated. They attended these lavish holiday dinners to partake in the glow of the Garcia wealth. They accepted the expensive food and the vintage champagne, and in exchange, they provided the validation Victoria craved. They were her enablers. By sitting in stunned silence while she dismantled my character, they were endorsing her cruelty. I recognized the intricate social contract binding them to their chairs. If any of them spoke up to defend me, they risked being exiled from the inner circle. They risked losing their invitations to the summer parties and the winter galas. They chose the warmth of the chandelier over the cold reality of the truth. This realization stripped away any residual loyalty I felt toward the extended family. They were not a safety net. They were a captive audience paying for their dinner with my reputation. I looked at Aunt Margaret. Her eyes were fixed on me, wide and unblinking. She lived for these moments of social rupture. She would spend the next 6 months recounting this exact scene at every country club luncheon, embellishing the details, describing how devastated I looked when the news was announced. I looked at Cousin David. He was already planning his exit strategy, calculating how soon he could politely excuse himself and his wife without offending the host. And then I looked back at Victoria. She was still standing, her champagne flute held halfway to her chest. The seconds stretched into an agonizing eternity. The power she thought she wielded was evaporating into the cold air seeping through the window pane. She realized with a sudden and visible jolt of panic that she had pushed me into a corner where I no longer had anything to lose. When you strip a person of their fear, you give them pure clarity. I had spent my life afraid of this exact moment. I had feared the public rejection. I had feared being cast out of the family narrative. But now that the moment had arrived, the fear was gone. The worst thing she could do had already been done. There was no longer any need to hide the ledgers. There was no longer any need to protect the fragile egos of the people sitting at this table. The audit was moving from the digital realm into the physical world. I took a slow, deep breath, tasting the rich aroma of the roasted turkey and the sharp underlying scent of anxiety radiating from the guests. I prepared to break the dead silence. I prepared to show my mother that the daughter she tried to bury had spent years learning how to dig. The silence that followed my mother's toast was profound. It was a dense, heavy quiet that settled over the dining room like a thick layer of dust. 22 pairs of eyes remained fixed on my face, waiting for the dam to break. They expected the tears. They anticipated the trembling chin, the choked sob, the hasty retreat out the front doors into the freezing Connecticut night. I did not cry. The expected breakdown never materialized. Instead, a glacial stillness settled over my limbs. The frantic adrenaline that usually accompanies public humiliation evaporated, leaving behind a state of pure, chilling calm. I reached for the thick linen napkin resting across my lap. I gathered the fabric with slow, deliberate precision. I lifted it and placed it flat onto the polished mahogany table. I smoothed the edges, tracing the invisible seams with my index finger. The motion was purposeful. It mirrored the exact gesture I utilize when I open a fresh appraisal ledger in front of a hostile client. It is a physical declaration that pleasantries have concluded and the audit has begun. I lifted my chin and met my mother's triumphant gaze. The flush of victory had painted her cheeks a rosy pink. She stood tall, her champagne flute still hovering in the air, waiting for her final applause. I offered her a smile. It was not a warm expression. It was a razor-thin, terrifying curving of the lips, devoid of any genuine humor. It was the smile of an investigator recognizing a trap they had already dismantled. "Thank you for your concern, Mother," I said. My voice did not echo, but it cut through the heavy silence with surgical precision. It was steady. It was unshakable. It lacked any trace of the devastated victim she had just described to the room. "But if we are giving thanks for truth," I continued, letting the words hang in the air for a fraction of a second, "we should wait for all of it." The effect was instantaneous. Victoria's triumphant smirk faltered. The rosy flush drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin a pale, sallow shade. The hand holding the crystal glass dipped, causing the golden liquid to slosh dangerously near the rim. She tried to maintain her regal posture, but a sudden, unmistakable rigidity seized her shoulders. The psychological temperature of the room inverted. The oppressive heat of their collective judgment vanished, replaced by a creeping, icy dread. My refusal to play the victim broke the script Victoria had so carefully written. I was supposed to be the tragic casualty of a failed marriage. By rejecting the role, I threw the entire cast into disarray. The relatives, sensing the sudden shift in power, began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. The leather and wood creaked a chorus of nervous adjustments. An aunt seated across from me lowered her gaze, suddenly finding her soup bowl fascinating. Cousin David reached up and tugged at his silk tie as if the collar of his expensive shirt had suddenly grown too tight. Sarah sat frozen to my left. Her smug, condescending smirk melted into a frown of deep confusion. She looked from me to Victoria, trying to understand why the matriarch was suddenly radiating fear instead of authority. Sarah relied on the established hierarchy to validate her own status. Seeing me defy the head of the family without a trace of fear destabilized her entire worldview. Next to her, Lucas shifted his weight. He reached for his water glass, his hand moving with a jerky, uncoordinated motion. He took a long sip, avoiding my eyes. He is the golden child, conditioned to thrive in the comfortable shadow of our mother's control. He felt the friction in the air, the undeniable collision of two opposing forces, and he possessed no tools to handle it. In my line of work, I frequently encounter people selling forged provenance. They present a painting, swear it belonged to a European aristocrat, and demand a premium valuation. When I lay the chemical analysis on the table, proving the pigments were manufactured last decade, their faces undergo a very specific transformation. The bluster vanishes, replaced by the primitive fear of exposure. I watched that exact transformation take hold of my mother's features. She recognized that my calm demeanor was not an act of denial. It was the confidence of someone holding superior evidence. Isabella Victoria managed to say, her voice losing its theatrical resonance. It sounded thin and reedy. "I do not know what you mean. You are clearly distraught. The shock of the betrayal is making you speak out of turn." I remained perfectly still. I did not raise my voice. The loudest person in the room is rarely the one holding the power. "I am not distraught," I replied softly. "I have never felt more lucid in my entire life." I looked at the lavish spread of food laid out before us. The roasted butternut squash soup was growing cold in its porcelain bowls. The silver platters holding the main course seemed absurd, now remnants of a celebration that never actually existed. This entire dinner was a monument to fiction. The house was mortgaged beyond its value. The vintage wine was gone. The jewels on my mother's wrist were laboratory-grown carbon. And the story of my husband's infidelity was just another synthetic creation designed to distract the audience from the reality of their own impending ruin. My calm was not just a defense mechanism. It was a weapon. By refusing to engage in her hysterics, I forced Victoria to fight on a battlefield she did not understand. She was an expert in emotional manipulation. She knew how to twist guilt and shame into a leash. But she had no defense against objective, unfeeling data. She had no strategy for a daughter who viewed her not as an authority figure, but as a fraudulent asset ready to be liquidated. The dining table transformed before their eyes. The expensive silver cutlery suddenly looked like evidence markers. The crystal goblets resembled gavels waiting to fall. The lavish Thanksgiving dinner had morphed into a courtroom. And I sat in the drafty corner not as the accused, but as the presiding judge. The audience leaned in. The curiosity in the room overpowered their allegiance to Victoria. Human nature craves the resolution of a mystery, and I had just promised them a revelation that would shatter the evening's narrative. They stopped looking at me with pity. They started looking at me with fearful anticipation. They knew the gavel was about to drop. Victoria set her champagne flute down. The bass hit the table with a harsh, ungraceful clatter. She placed her palms flat against the mahogany, leaning forward in a desperate attempt to reclaim her physical dominance over the space. "Perhaps you should go upstairs and rest," she commanded. The false sweetness was gone, replaced by a brittle, defensive edge. "We can discuss your emotional state tomorrow, in private. It is unfair to subject our guests to this kind of outburst." "It is not an outburst," I corrected her. "And we will discuss it tonight, right now. You convened this assembly to discuss my marriage. You raised a glass to my personal life. It would be rude to leave your guests without the proper conclusion to the story you started." Sarah let out a soft, involuntary gasp. No one spoke to Victoria in that tone. No one challenged her directives in her own home. The rebellion was unprecedented, and it was unfolding in slow motion right in front of their carefully curated appetizers. I glanced down at my smartphone. The screen was still dark, but the microphone was still active. I knew Julian had heard the toast. I knew he had heard my response. I could visualize him turning off the engine of his car. I could picture him stepping out into the freezing Connecticut air, his boots crunching against the gravel driveway. The ticking clock had reached its final second. The waiting period was over. Victoria opened her mouth to issue another command to summon the staff and have me physically removed from the room if necessary. Her eyes burned with a frantic, desperate energy. She was trying to plug a leak in a dam that was already collapsing. "You are going to leave this table immediately," she hissed, her facade of maternal grief entirely abandoned. I did not answer her. I did not need to. I just kept my razor-thin smile fixed on her pale face, waiting for the heavy oak doors in the foyer to swing open. The truth she had tried so hard to bury was currently walking up the front steps, and he was bringing the receipts. Victoria drew a sharp, ragged breath. She expanded her chest, preparing to issue a severe command, intending to summon the household staff to have me physically removed from the dining room. Her eyes darted toward the kitchen swinging door, anticipating the arrival of the servers she could weaponize against me. Before a single syllable could escape her throat, a resonant, low groan echoed from the front of the house. The heavy oak double doors framing the main entryway swung inward with a forceful thrust. A blast of freezing Connecticut winter air swept into the foyer, carrying the distinct metallic scent of impending snow and damp wool. The sudden change in air pressure caused the flames of the dining room taper candles to flicker wildly, casting erratic, dancing shadows against the antique wallpaper. Then came the footsteps. Thud, thud, thud. It was a measured, rhythmic cadence. Heavy rubber-soled winter boots striking the imported marble tiles of the grand entryway. The sound bypassed all polite society etiquette. It was the tread of a man who did not care about scuffing historic floorboards or interrupting a refined gathering. The confident rhythm signaled an incoming storm. Every head in the dining room snapped away from me and turned toward the arched doorway. The hushed, judgmental whispers ceased instantly. The delicate clinking of silver against porcelain vanished. The room fell into an eerie, suspended animation. Julian emerged from the shadows of the long hallway and stepped into the warm, golden glow of the tiered chandelier. He wore his tailored charcoal wool overcoat, the high collar turned up against the chill, with scattered melting snowflakes clinging to the dark, textured fabric. He looked imposing, an intrusion of harsh, undeniable reality crashing into a delicate, highly curated fantasy. In his left hand, he gripped a thick manila folder. It was overstuffed, the rough cardboard edges strained by the sheer volume of printed spreadsheets, bank ledgers, and legal documents threatening to spill out into the open. A chorus of sharp, involuntary intakes of breath erupted around the long mahogany table. Aunt Margaret dropped her linen napkin straight onto her lap, her jaw hanging slack, the pearls around her neck sitting motionless. Cousin David blinked rapidly, his mind visibly struggling to process the stark visual contradiction standing before him. Just 3 minutes ago, the matriarch of the family had formally declared this exact man a fugitive husband, a traitor who had fled the state to hide with a phantom lover. Yet here he stood, broad-shouldered, resolute, and very much present, occupying the very space he was supposed to have permanently abandoned. Victoria stood completely paralyzed at the head of the table. Her crystal champagne flute hovered frozen in midair. The rosy, triumphant flush of her fabricated victory drained away in a matter of seconds, leaving her skin a chalky, sickly hue. Her lips parted, but she produced no sound. The devastating narrative she had so meticulously woven was unraveling thread by thread right before her eyes. Julian is a digital security architect. His daily professional life involves sitting across from panicked chief executive officers and explaining exactly how their impenetrable corporate firewalls were breached by external threats. He is entirely immune to executive posturing, and he is equally impervious to Greenwich high society theatrics. He did not look at my mother. He did not acknowledge the 22 gaping relatives staring at him as if he were a ghost. His focus remained singular, unbroken, and directed entirely at me. He walked the entire length of the room, passing the rows of stunned, silent guests. At formal family dinners, the seating arrangement dictates the social hierarchy. Victoria had constructed a flawless perimeter of 23 matching velvet-upholstered dining chairs, specifically erasing Julian's designated spot to physically manifest my isolation. A lesser man might have demanded his proper seat. He might have asked a lesser cousin to move, or insisted the catering staff fetch a matching chair from the parlor to integrate himself back into the established aesthetic order. Julian bypassed the mahogany table entirely. He detoured toward the butler's pantry alcove near the kitchen entrance. Leaning against the plaster wall was a rugged, scuffed wooden folding chair, a spare piece kept hidden away for the catering staff to use during their breaks. He grabbed it by the top rail. In a fluid, unbroken motion, he snatched a flimsy white paper plate from a discard stack resting on the serving counter. He carried the rugged wooden chair and the cheap paper plate back to my drafty corner of the room. He snapped the wooden frame open with a sharp, echoing clatter that made Sarah physically flinch in her seat. He wedged the makeshift lowbrow seat right next to my pristine, isolated spot. He tossed the paper plate onto the tablecloth, letting it land right over the polished heirloom silver and the crystal water goblet. The visual contrast was striking and brilliant. Amidst the delicate bone china, the gleaming sterling silver, and the elaborate autumnal floral centerpieces, that stark white paper plate screamed defiance. It was a physical rejection of the matriarch's aesthetic dominance. It broadcasted a clear, undeniable message. He did not need her approval, her fine china, or her permission to occupy space in this room. Julian sat down in the creaking wooden chair. He did not remove his winter overcoat. He leaned toward me and placed his large, warm hand firmly on my left shoulder. The lingering chill that had seeped into my bones from the drafty window vanished instantly. The solid, reassuring weight of his palm grounded me. For the past 3 hours, I had acted as the solitary operative behind enemy lines, absorbing the microaggressions, the fake sympathy, and the calculated cruelty of my extended family. Now my backup had arrived. The physical contact was not just a gesture of affection. It was a territorial claim. He was showing every single person in that dining room that I was not a discarded, unloved woman. I was protected, I was chosen. "You look cold," he murmured. His deep, resonant voice carried easily across the silent room. "I am fine now," I replied, reaching up and placing my hand over his fingers. Julian finally turned his attention to the head of the table. He looked directly at Victoria. He did not glare or scowl. He studied her with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a highly predictable chemical reaction. "Victoria," he said. His tone was casual, conversational, and devoid of any raised volume or malice. It was the supreme confidence of a man holding a royal flush. My mother's mouth opened and closed again. She resembled a fish pulled from the water, suffocating in the sudden glaring truth of his presence. "Julian?" she managed to squeak. The word was brittle, cracking under the heavy weight of her rising panic. "What are you doing here? You are supposed to be out of the state." She could not finish the thought. She could not force her mouth to say the words, "another woman," while the man in question sat closely beside me, his thumb drawing slow, reassuring circles on my shoulder blade. "I was delayed," Julian answered smoothly, brushing a melting snowflake from his lapel. He lifted his left hand and brought the thick manila folder out over the expanse of the table. He did not hand it to her politely. He did not slide it gently across the linen. He tossed it. The heavy cardboard slapped against the polished mahogany with a resounding, echoing thud. It landed dead center, right next to the lavishly garnished Thanksgiving turkey. The sudden impact sent a slight visible tremor through the nearby wine glasses, causing the vintage champagne to ripple. The folder was not just a collection of papers. It was the physical embodiment of the ticking clock we had been waiting for all month. It contained the harvested internet service provider logs. It held the digital footprints of the prepaid burner phone. It enclosed the public county records of the secondary mortgages and the forged signatures on the irrevocable trust fund documents. I watched the relatives stare at the brown envelope as if it were a ticking bomb. Their curiosity was a tangible electric current running through the room. A moment ago, they were eager, willing consumers of Victoria's fabricated gossip. Now their loyalties were violently fracturing. The matriarch had sworn her son-in-law was gone forever, yet he was sitting right there, challenging her ultimate authority with a stack of raw data. The grand illusion of Victoria's flawless control was shattering into 1,000 irreparable fragments. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes locked onto the folder. Her synthetic, mocking concern was replaced by genuine, creeping apprehension. Lucas gripped his linen napkin, his knuckles turning stark white, sensing deep down that the comfortable, passive existence he relied upon was contained within that cardboard sleeve. I needed to verify a few final details in the city. Julian continued, keeping his voice even and unhurried. You see, when someone goes through the immense trouble of inventing a phantom affair to ruin a marriage, they usually leave a digital paper trail. And I am remarkably proficient at following trails. He leaned back in the creaking wooden folding chair, his hand remaining securely anchored on my shoulder. He looked at the flimsy paper plate resting in front of him, then shifted his gaze back up to the terrified matriarch standing at the head of the table. "So," he prompted, raising a single eyebrow, "what did I miss?" The stage was set, the audience was captive. The false narrative had been dismantled by his mere entrance, and now the true financial audit was about to spill across the holiday table. Julian reached out with his right hand and rested his fingertips on the thick cardboard cover of the manila folder. He did not rush. He unclasped the metal prongs with a deliberate metallic snap that echoed down the length of the dining room. The guests sat frozen, their breathing shallow, their eyes darting between the grim stoicism on my husband's face and the pale, rigid terror spreading across my mother's features. "You spent the last hour painting a tragic picture," Victoria, Julian began. His tone was level, carrying the professional cadence of a board meeting rather than the heated pitch of a family dispute. "You delivered a highly compelling narrative, but narratives require evidence to survive scrutiny." He opened the folder and extracted a thick sheaf of crisp white paper. He slid the top 3 pages down the center of the mahogany table. The documents glided over the polished wood, coming to a halt near the centerpiece of autumnal squash and lit taper candles. "I was delayed pulling the final internet service provider logs from my firm," Julian announced, his voice projecting clearly. I needed to wait for a specific decryption sequence to finish processing. When someone goes to such immense lengths to fabricate an infidelity, they invariably leave a digital footprint. And your footprint, Victoria, was exceptionally careless. Victoria gripped the edge of the table. Her knuckles turned a stark, translucent white. "This is absurd," she hissed, though her voice lacked its usual commanding resonance. "You are bringing fabricated corporate spreadsheets to a Thanksgiving dinner to terrorize me. I will not be subjected to this theater." Julian ignored her protest entirely. He picked up the next document in his stack, a printed transcript featuring lines of text enclosed in gray and blue message bubbles. "The story you fed this room was built on a very small, calculated grain of truth." He continued looking around the table at the captivated relatives. "I was, in fact, receiving explicit messages from a woman who was not my wife." A collective quiet gasp rippled through the audience. Beside my brother, Sarah leaned forward, a brief flash of vindication appearing in her eyes. She thought the ledger was proving her right. She thought my husband was confessing to the very sin my mother had accused him of committing. I sat beside Julian, perfectly serene, watching the trap open its jaws. "However," Julian said, dropping the transcript onto the table, "she was not a mistress. She was an independent contractor. To be specific, she is a high-tier escort operating out of a discreet boutique agency in Manhattan." The silence that seized the room was profound. It was a suffocating, heavy quiet, the kind that follows a sudden, devastating impact. Cousin David dropped his fork. It hit the edge of his china plate with a sharp clatter, the only sound in the paralyzed dining room. Aunt Margaret pressed a hand to her chest, her mouth forming a silent, horrified circle. My mother has spent her entire adult life operating under a singular, cynical philosophy. She believes every service, every loyalty, and every individual possesses a hidden price tag. She assumed she could purchase a fake affair just as easily as she purchased her country club endorsements or her designer wardrobe. She paid this woman an exorbitant retainer to send a steady stream of explicit texts and hotel receipts to Julian's secure work phone, intending to create an undeniable paper trail of infidelity. But my mother is an analog manipulator navigating a digital world. She knows how to deploy weaponized gossip at a charity luncheon, but she fundamentally misunderstands the modern landscape of risk. "The woman you hired is a seasoned professional," Victoria Julian explained, leaning back into his creaking wooden chair, "and professionals conduct thorough risk assessments before taking on a new client. When she ran a routine background check on her assigned target, she discovered my credentials. She saw the military defense contracting history. She saw the current cybersecurity auditing firm." Julian paused, letting the weight of his profession settle over the guests. She realized participating in a fabricated blackmail scheme against a forensic digital architect was a direct ticket to a federal wire fraud indictment, he said softly. The prospect of facing a federal prosecutor over a wealthy housewife's petty domestic plot spooked her. She wanted immunity. So 3 days ago, she contacted me through an encrypted channel. She flipped. Victoria swayed on her feet. Her champagne flute tipped over, spilling a pool of expensive vintage liquid across the white linen tablecloth. She did not even notice the stain spreading toward her plate. "She forwarded me the initial encrypted emails you sent her, outlining the script she was supposed to follow," Julian stated, tapping the documents resting on the table. "More importantly, she provided the banking routing numbers for the offshore wire transfer you used to pay her initial retainer." Julianne slid the banking receipt down the table. It stopped directly in front of Lucas. My brother stared at the highlighted routing numbers. The blood drained from his face, leaving his complexion a sickly grayish hue. He recognized the account. He knew it was tied to the family trust, the same trust he relied upon for his comfortable, passive existence. The realization that his mother was squandering their inheritance to hire Manhattan escorts for a smear campaign hit him with the force of a physical blow. "This is a lie," Victoria shrieked. The sound was harsh, jagged, and entirely devoid of her usual refined polish. She pointed a trembling finger at Julian. "You manufactured these documents to humiliate me. You hired that woman to cover your own tracks." It was a desperate, thrashing defense. She was a drowning woman grasping at thorns. Julian did not raise his voice to meet her panic. He remained an anchor of clinical, unfeeling logic. He reached into the folder one last time and pulled out a dense, multi-page report filled with raw data timestamps and network identifiers. I anticipated that exact defense. Julian countered smoothly. Which brings us to the Internet Service Provider logs. You bought a prepaid burner phone to coordinate the scheme with the agency. A clever strategy in theory, designed to keep your personal cellular device clean. However, your execution was remarkably flawed. He held up the top page of the network report. "You forgot to turn off the automatic network syncing on the burner device," he explained, his tone echoing a professor correcting a failing student. "When you brought the prepaid phone back to this estate, it automatically searched for a stable connection. You logged into the device's cloud backup account using this exact house's private wireless router." The dining room remained frozen, every guest hanging on his technical dismantling of the matriarch. "The IP addresses match perfectly," Julian declared, dropping the final report onto the stack. "The digital forensics placed the orchestrator of the scheme sitting in your home office, using your personal network footprint at the exact timestamps the payments were authorized." The irrefutable proof lay on the table, a stark, white monument to her deception. It was immune to her gaslighting. It could not be argued away with a theatrical sigh or a dismissive wave of the hand. Her grand, tragic narrative of a broken marriage and a wandering husband was laid bare as a desperate, clumsy fraud. Sarah shrank back into her chair, her prior smirk replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. She was looking at the woman she had admired and modeled her own life after, and she was seeing a desperate criminal. Cousin David stared at the ceiling, wishing he was anywhere else on the planet. The audience she had cultivated to witness my execution was now the jury presiding over her ruin. Victoria stood in the spreading pool of spilled champagne, her chest heaving. She had no moves left. She had brought a silver spoon to a digital execution. The guests were reeling from the sheer audacity of the escort plot. They were stunned by the lengths Victoria had gone to just to manufacture a divorce. But as I sat in the drafty corner, watching my mother's empire crumble, I knew the most devastating revelation was still waiting in the wings. People do not hire escorts and risk federal wire fraud simply out of spite. They do it when they are backed into a corner. They do it when they are hiding a much larger, much darker secret. The relatives were currently focused on the fabricated infidelity. They were captivated by the scandalous how. It was time to stand up and explain the why. Julian had laid out the digital trap with surgical precision. I watched my mother standing in the spreading pool of spilled vintage champagne. The entire room was buzzing with the shock of the escort revelation. But a scandal is just a distraction. A scandalous affair is the smoke intended to blind the audience. I wanted to show them the fire. I pushed my chair back from the table. The wooden legs scraped against the hardwood floor, a sharp, abrasive sound that drew every eye toward my drafty corner. I stood up. The physical act of rising changed the dining room. For the past 3 hours, I had been the silent, seated victim looking up at my accusers. Now I was standing tall, looking down. Julian leaned back in his creaking folding chair, yielding the floor to me. He had handled the digital forensics. The financial appraisal was my territory. I walked slowly toward the center of the mahogany table, stopping right next to the thick manila folder Julian had tossed near the floral centerpiece. I placed my hand flat on the remaining stack of documents inside the cardboard sleeve. The paper felt heavy, loaded with the weight of a decade of deception. I looked directly at Victoria. She was breathing rapidly, her chest rising and falling in erratic, shallow bursts. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for a sympathetic face, searching for an escape route. She was trying to formulate a defense against the burner phone IP addresses. She was preparing to argue about digital spoofing or hacked accounts. I did not give her the opportunity to spin another web. "You did not invent a mistress because you hate my husband," I said. My voice echoed off the plaster walls, crisp and resonant. "You did not hire that escort out of some twisted maternal desire to protect me from a toxic marriage. You did it because you are entirely bankrupt." The word bankrupt dropped into the dining room like a heavy stone into a still pond. In Greenwich society, infidelity is a common Tuesday afternoon topic. Divorce is an expected, almost celebrated milestone. But bankruptcy is an unforgivable sin. It is a contagious, terrifying disease that must be shunned at all costs. Aunt Margaret gasped, bringing her manicured hands up to cover her mouth. Cousin David stopped looking at his plate and stared at the silk curtains, his eyes narrowing as he suddenly calculated if the fabric was already repossessed property. The subtle shift in their posture was immediate. They pulled back from the table, physically distancing themselves from the matriarch. I reached into the folder and pulled out a clipped stock of heavy stock paper. They were not corporate spreadsheets or printed text messages. They were copies of public records stamped with the raised official seal of the county clerk. I slid them down the polished wood, spreading them out like a deck of tarot cards, predicting absolute ruin. "These are the current property deeds for this estate," I announced, tapping the official blue seals with my index finger. "And these are the secondary and tertiary mortgages filed against it. You took out a high-yield predatory loan against the equity 6 months ago. The interest rate is staggering. You missed the last 3 payments. The bank filed a quiet notice of default last week." Victoria gripped the back of her velvet dining chair. Her knuckles protruded sharply beneath her pale skin. "That is a temporary liquidity issue," she stammered, her voice thin, reedy, and lacking its usual authoritative bass. "Wealth management is complex, Isabella. You do not understand how these trusts are structured. It is merely a bridge loan while the family portfolio rebalances." "I am an estate appraiser," I replied, keeping my tone clinical, detached, and utterly unyielding. "I understand exactly how trusts are structured. I evaluate insolvent estates every single day. I know what a sinking ship looks like on paper. Your portfolio is not rebalancing. Your portfolio was liquidated 3 years ago to pay off your private credit lines." I picked up another sheet of paper from the stack. This one detailed my own financial history, a document I had procured long before this Thanksgiving dinner. When my grandfather passed away, he established a separate, irrevocable private trust in my name. He structured it carefully, knowing my mother possessed a reckless, insatiable appetite for luxury. The principal was locked, but the interest generated a substantial annual yield meant for my future. When I married Julian, that trust gained a new layer of armor. Julian is a forensic accountant and a digital security auditor. His name was added as an advisory oversight to my personal accounts. He reviews every wire transfer, every withdrawal, and every requested disbursement. He acts as a human firewall. I looked around the table, making sure every guest understood the mechanics of the financial trap Victoria had tried to spring. My mother was drowning in systemic debt, I explained to the silent, captive audience. She had drained the primary family accounts. She had mortgaged this historic house to the breaking point. She needed a substantial influx of cash to prevent imminent foreclosure and maintain this grand illusion. She needed unrestricted access to my private trust. But she could not manipulate the funds or forge the transfer documents while a cybersecurity auditor was reviewing the ledgers every month. The realization washed over the relatives in a visible, sickening wave. They looked at Julian, then at me, and finally back at the pale, trembling matriarch standing in the spilled champagne. The elaborate gossip she had fed them all month was suddenly recontextualized. It was not a mother worrying about her daughter. It was a predator trying to isolate its prey. Julian was the roadblock, I said, pointing at the printed hotel receipts resting near the gravy boat. You needed him removed from the equation. You needed me, divorced, emotionally shattered, and moving back into my childhood bedroom. You wanted me vulnerable, depressed, and entirely dependent on your guidance. If I came crawling back to this house seeking your maternal sanctuary, you knew you could convince a weeping daughter to sign over her power of attorney. You would have drained my grandfather's trust to pay your predatory lenders, leaving me just as destitute as you are right now." The opulent surroundings suddenly took on a sinister, hollow quality. The glittering chandelier overhead no longer looked like a symbol of enduring generational wealth. It looked like seized collateral waiting for a bank representative. The antique silver soup tureens and the imported Persian rugs transformed into inventory waiting for the auction block. The relatives shrank further away from the table, as if touching the mahogany might infect them with her insolvency. "This is an outrage," Victoria cried out. She was shaking now, an uncontrollable tremor racking her slender frame. "You are twisting standard financial maneuvers to make me look like a monster. I have provided everything for this family. I have maintained our standing in this community. I have kept the Garcia name respected." "You maintained a movie set," I corrected her, my voice dropping to a low, unforgiving register. "And you were willing to destroy my marriage and my sanity just to keep the cameras rolling for a few more months." I slid the county clerk documents further down the table. The numbers printed in bold black ink stared up at the guests. Millions of dollars in leveraged debt, accrued late penalties, final default notices. The numbers do not lie, and they do not care about social standing or country club memberships. They cut through the emotional manipulation and exposed the core of unfiltered financial panic driving her every move. She had played the role of the concerned, grieving mother with flawless precision. But underneath the expensive emerald dress and the fake moissanite bracelet, she was just a desperate debtor trying to steal her daughter's future to pay for her own past mistakes. Sarah sat frozen in her chair, her eyes darting between the default notices and her mother-in-law. Her perfect blonde hair seemed to lose its luster. She had built her entire identity around being the favored member of the elite Garcia dynasty. Hearing that the dynasty was heavily leveraged to predatory lenders shattered her entire worldview. Her Cape Cod pedigree meant nothing if she was tethered to a sinking ship. She looked at her husband, expecting him to refute my claims, expecting him to produce a hidden asset to save their pride. But Lucas remained silent. He stared at the papers with a vacant, hollow expression. I looked at my brother, observing his profound paralysis. He thought the audit ended with my private trust. He thought he was merely a bystander witnessing a bitter battle between his mother and his sister. He believed his own financial safety net was securely insulated from the wreckage spreading across the dining room table. He was wrong. My mother's desperation had no boundaries, and her theft was not limited to her daughter. The guests were murmuring in horror at the revelation of the mortgages, but the true fracture of the family had not yet occurred. It was time to show the golden child exactly how much his passive, comfortable compliance had cost him. I reached back into the thick manila folder resting on the mahogany table. My fingers brushed against a separate bundle of heavy stock papers, bound by a thick metal binder clip. The first phase of the audit had dismantled the matriarch and exposed the rot beneath the floorboards. The second phase was designed to address the enablers who had comfortably lived inside that rotting house. I shifted my focus away from the weeping woman standing in the spilled champagne. I turned my attention toward the head of the table. Lucas sat rigid in his velvet-upholstered dining chair. He was staring at the default notices scattered near the gravy boat, trying desperately to compartmentalize the disaster unfolding around him. He thought the explosion was contained. He thought the blast radius was limited to Victoria and me. He believed his role tonight was merely a passive spectator, watching his sister endure a public execution from the safety of his privileged vantage point. My brother is 34 years old. He holds a largely ceremonial title at a boutique investment firm in Manhattan, a position secured entirely through the fading influence of our late father's country club connections. His actual salary barely covers the maintenance fees on his penthouse condominium. His real income, the money that funds his tailored Italian suits, his weekend excursions to the Hamptons, and his wife's endless designer wardrobe, flows directly from his designated tier of the Garcia Family Trust. He learned very early in life that agreeing with Victoria guaranteed a smooth, prosperous existence. He traded his spine for a steady direct deposit. I slid the clipped bundle of papers across the polished wood. The heavy document glided over the table and came to a stop mere inches from his crystal water goblet. "Look at the third page, Lucas," I instructed. My voice carried no malice, only the cold, unyielding weight of a finalized ledger. He flinched. His shoulders drew up toward his ears. He did not want to touch the paper. He recognized the distinctive watermark of his own private wealth management institution embossed in the top corner. Ignorance had been his shield for 3 decades, and he knew picking up that document would shatter it permanently. "Read it," I said, keeping my gaze locked onto his pale face. "There are no shortcuts out of this room." He reached out with a trembling hand. He flipped past the executive summary sheet, bypassed the standard banking disclaimers, and stopped on the third page. It was a detailed, line-by-line ledger of asset pledges and final withdrawals. The transformation was terrifying to witness. The healthy, confident flush of the golden child evaporated into the dry, heated air of the dining room. His skin took on the pallor of crushed chalk. His eyes widened, tracking the columns of numbers, searching frantically for a decimal point error, praying for a clerical mistake that did not exist. "What is this?" Lucas whispered. His voice was hollow, stripped of all its usual arrogance and unearned authority. "The balance is 0. This account holds secure index funds. It cannot be 0. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the edge of the table. I wanted every relative in the room to hear the mechanics of the theft. An irrevocable trust is designed to be untouchable by the primary trustee, I explained. Victoria could not simply wire those funds to her personal checking account to cover the mortgage. The bank requires notarized physical signatures from the listed beneficiaries to pledge those specific protected assets as collateral. I reached over and flipped to the next page of his bundle. It was a high-risk commercial margin loan agreement signed and dated 6 months ago. The terms were predatory, designed for desperate borrowers willing to leverage everything for a quick injection of cash. "Take a very close look at the bottom line," I prompted. Lucas stared at the signature line. His own name was scrawled across the paper in blue ink. Beside it rested the elaborate looping signature of his wife. "I did not sign this," Lucas choked out. His chest began to rise and fall in sharp, panicked jerks. "We were vacationing in St. Bart's the week this document is dated. I never saw this paperwork. I never met with this lender. That is because Victoria forged both of your names," I stated. The truth hit the room like a physical shockwave. She pledged your entire protected portfolio as collateral for a short-term, high-interest commercial loan to cover her mounting real estate debts. And when she defaulted on that commercial loan last month, the lender legally seized the collateral. Your trust is gone, Lucas. She burned your future to heat her house. Sarah leaned over her husband's shoulder. Her manicured nails dug into the fabric of his expensive cashmere sweater. Her eyes scanned the zero balances and the stark foreclosure warnings printed on the banking stationery. Sarah originates from old New England money, but that specific pedigree of wealth is notoriously illiquid. Her family owns historic crumbling estates and thousands of acres of protected marshland that generate immense tax burdens and zero revenue. She relies entirely on her husband's monthly trust disbursements to fund her reality. Without that steady cash flow, she is effectively destitute, trapped in a lavish lifestyle she can no longer afford to maintain. A shrill, piercing gasp escaped Sarah's throat. It was the raw, unedited sound of pure terror. Her hand flew to her chest, striking her water goblet in the process. The heavy crystal tipped over and shattered against the edge of her porcelain plate. A spray of water and sharp glass shards scattered across the expensive linen tablecloth, but nobody moved to clean it up. "You took everything," Sarah shrieked. She turned her furious, tear-filled gaze toward the matriarch standing at the head of the table. "You told us the trust was outperforming the market. You told us to put a cash offer on the Nantucket house. We signed the purchase agreement yesterday." Victoria launched herself forward. She scrambled across the spilled champagne, her hands grasping frantically for the bank statements resting in front of her son. The regal, untouchable facade was completely destroyed. "It was a bridge loan," Victoria wept. Genuine tears finally spilled down her cheeks, ruining her pristine applied makeup. Dark, ugly streaks of mascara ran down her face, pooling in the fine lines around her mouth. I had a private arrangement with the loan officer. I just needed 90 days to secure a quiet buyer for the grandfather clocks and the parlor artwork. I was going to replace the funds before the quarter ended. You have to understand, Lucas, I was protecting our legacy. I was keeping the family name alive. Lucas did not look at his weeping mother. He stared straight ahead at the dining room wall, his eyes vacant and unfocused. The karmic justice was swift and devastating. The complicit silence he had weaponized against me his entire life had just boomeranged back and severed his own throat. He had watched Victoria abuse me, isolate me, and spread vicious lies about my marriage. He had poured me cheap wine and looked the other way because ignoring my pain kept his bank account full. He believed his compliance was an impenetrable shield. He finally realized that to a predator, compliance is just an invitation to feed. The toxic peace he maintained by throwing me to the wolves had cost him his entire financial safety net. He traded his sister's well-being for a trust fund that his mother stole anyway. He had sold his soul to protect a bounced check. The dining room descended into absolute chaos. Relatives were pushing their chairs back, desperate to escape the blast radius of the imploding family. Aunts and cousins huddled near the archway, whispering frantically, calculating how quickly they could retrieve their coats from the foyer and flee the property. Sarah was sobbing hysterically, clutching the forged commercial loan agreement to her chest as if holding the paper tight enough might magically restore the missing funds. Victoria was weeping loudly, her manicured hands clawing at the tablecloth, begging her son to look at her, begging him to listen to her frantic, illogical excuses. I stood quietly next to Julian, observing the wreckage. The audit was nearly complete. We had delivered the proof, exposed the motive, and fractured the alliance of the enablers. I watched Lucas slowly lift his head. The passive, indifferent brother I had known my entire life was gone, replaced by a stranger. His eyes were dark, calculating, and filled with a cold, terrifying fury. He did not scream at his wife to calm down. He did not yell at his mother for betraying him. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out his smartphone. The screen cast a harsh blue light over his pale features. The sounds of the weeping women and the fleeing guests seemed to fade into the background as he unlocked the device. His thumb hovered over the digital keypad. He was not calling a financial advisor to assess the damage. He was not calling a therapist to process the betrayal. He was navigating to his contacts list, preparing to initiate the one specific sequence of events our mother feared far more than social ruin or public bankruptcy. The final legal checkmate was about to be played. The blue light from the smartphone screen illuminated Lucas. His face resembled a marble statue, drained of all color and warmth. He did not blink. He held the device in his palm with a grip so tight his knuckles strained against the skin. The chaotic soundtrack of the dining room swirled around him. Sarah wept uncontrollably over her ruined financial security. Our mother babbled a stream of desperate, incoherent apologies, pawing at the edge of the mahogany table. Lucas ignored them both. He tapped the screen. A sharp, rhythmic ringing tone broadcasted from the device speaker. He had put the call on speakerphone. He wanted the entire room to hear the destruction of the matriarch. He wanted every remaining relative to witness the exact moment he severed the umbilical cord of toxic wealth. The phone rang 3 times. Each electronic pulse seemed to suck the remaining oxygen out of the formal dining space. Victoria stopped pleading. Her tear-streaked face turned toward the black rectangle in her son's hand. She recognized the number displayed on the screen. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, buckling her knees and sending her slumping back into her velvet-upholstered chair. Harrison Cole Law Group, an automated voice answered. Our offices are currently closed for the holiday. If this is an emergency, please press 1 to be connected to the on-call partner. Lucas pressed the number 1. A brief sequence of hold music played a tinny classical sonata that mocked the opulent surroundings of the ruined dinner. Then a tired, deep voice broke the music. "This is Richard Sterling," Richard Lucas said. His voice lacked any inflection. It was the flat, deadened tone of a man standing over a grave. "This is Lucas Garcia." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Lucas, it is Thanksgiving evening. Is everything all right?" "No," Lucas replied, keeping his eyes locked onto our mother. "I am sitting at the family dinner table. I am looking at a commercial margin loan agreement bearing my signature. It pledges the entirety of my irrevocable trust as collateral for a high-yield bridge loan." Another pause followed this one, thicker and laden with professional caution. The attorney recognized the legal hazard blooming in his ear. "I recall that paperwork being processed last month," the attorney stated carefully. "Your mother facilitated the transfer. She provided the notarized signature pages." "I was in St. Bart's the week those pages were allegedly signed," Lucas countered. "My passport stamps will verify my location. My wife was with me. Neither of us met with a notary. Neither of us authorized the pledge. My mother forged the documents, Richard, and your firm filed them." Victoria let out a low, wounded sound. She clutched her throat, her chest heaving as the legal implications solidified in the air. Forgery, fraud, breach of fiduciary duty. These were not societal faux pas to be glossed over at a country club luncheon. These were felony offenses carrying mandatory prison sentences. The protective bubble of Greenwich high society could not shield her from federal banking regulations. "I am formally freezing all accounts associated with the Garcia estate," Lucas instructed. The command echoed through the dining room. "I am initiating a fraud investigation effective immediately. Do not process another transfer. Do not authorize another disbursement. And do not take another phone call from my mother without my direct, recorded supervision. We will be in your office at 8 on Monday morning. Have your malpractice insurance representative present." Lucas tapped the red icon on his screen, terminating the call. The dial tone hummed for a fraction of a second before the room plunged into a suffocating quiet. The execution was complete. The golden child had delivered the fatal strike. Victoria collapsed inward. The rigid, regal posture she had cultivated for decades dissolved entirely. She shrank down into her velvet chair, looking remarkably small and fragile. The expensive emerald dress sagged against her shoulders. The laboratory-grown diamonds on her wrist hung limp, mocking her desperation. Her carefully curated empire, built on a foundation of lies and funded by stolen futures, had burned to the ground in less than 20 minutes. And it had burned in front of the exact audience she had assembled to witness my downfall. The relatives remaining in the room stared at her. The pity they had reserved for me earlier in the evening vanished, replaced by a potent, unmistakable mixture of disgust and horror. These were people who worshipped at the altar of wealth and propriety. They could tolerate cruelty, but they could never tolerate insolvency or criminal exposure. Victoria was no longer the benevolent matriarch dispensing favors. She was a liability. She was a social contagion. Aunt Margaret took a deliberate step backward, physically distancing herself from the head of the table. She clutched her purse tightly against her side. Cousin David turned his back on Victoria entirely, ushering his pale, shaking wife toward the arched doorway leading to the foyer. The Whisper Network, the very tool Victoria had honed and weaponized against me, was turning its gears in a new direction. By tomorrow morning, the entire Eastern Seaboard elite would know that Victoria Garcia was a bankrupt fraud facing federal indictment. The public shaming she had meticulously designed for her daughter had completely inverted. She had tried to isolate me, but she had only succeeded in exiling herself. She sat alone at the head of a ruined table, surrounded by cold food, spilled wine, and shattered crystal. I stood next to Julian in the drafty corner of the dining room. I surveyed the wreckage spread out before us. I looked at Sarah sobbing into her hands, grieving the loss of her unearned luxury. I looked at Lucas staring blankly at his dormant phone, processing the bitter taste of a reality he could no longer avoid. I looked at my mother, a broken, weeping shell of a woman who had sacrificed her own children to feed her ego. I searched my chest for a flicker of guilt. I searched for the familiar, conditioned urge to step forward and fix the mess. I waited for the heavy burden of familial obligation to settle over my shoulders. It never arrived. I felt nothing but a profound, cleansing relief. I had not caused this destruction. I had not forged the signatures, liquidated the wine cellar, or hired the escort. I had merely refused to continue paying the electric bill for a house built on toxic secrets. I had simply turned on the lights and let everyone in the room look at the rot they had all helped to cultivate. Julian squeezed my shoulder. His presence was a steady, solid anchor amidst the emotional debris. He leaned down, and his voice a low, reassuring murmur against my ear. "The audit is finished," he said. I nodded, acknowledging the truth of his words. The ledgers were closed. The hidden debts were exposed. The toxic peace was permanently broken. There was nothing left for me to appraise in this house. The Greenwich estate held zero value. I picked up my small leather clutch from the mahogany table. I did not bother pushing my chair in. I turned away from the bay window and the cold Connecticut wind pressing against the glass. It was time to leave the battlefield. It was time to step out of the shadows and claim the clean, honest life waiting for me beyond the heavy oak doors. The remaining guests parted like the Red Sea as Julian and I began our walk toward the foyer. They refused to make eye contact with us. They recognized the power dynamic had shifted permanently, and they lacked the courage to acknowledge the new reality. We moved past the shattered crystal and the scattered county clerk documents, leaving the weeping matriarch and her fractured enablers to sort through the ashes of their own making. The final chapter of my association with the Garcia family was drawing to a close, paving the way for a single, defining exit. Julian and I turned our backs on the wreckage. We took exactly 3 steps toward the arched doorway. We were almost clear of the dining room when the sound of scrambling disrupted our quiet departure. Fabric tore. A chair tipped backward, hitting the floorboards with a dull thud. "Isabella, wait!" The voice was unrecognizable. It lacked the polished theatrical resonance that had commanded the Greenwich Country Club for 3 decades. It was a raw, reedy gasp, choked with genuine panic. I paused, my leather clutch held loosely in my right hand. Julian stopped beside me, his presence a solid, unmoving wall of support. I turned slowly, allowing my gaze to sweep over the room one last time. Victoria stumbled around the edge of the long mahogany table. She moved with a frantic, uncoordinated desperation, her heels slipping on the polished wood. She stopped a few feet away from us, her chest heaving as she struggled to draw oxygen into her lungs. The visual transformation was stark. The matriarch was gone. Standing before me was a cornered, terrified debtor. Dark streaks of ruined makeup stained her cheeks. Her elaborate updo had partially collapsed, leaving strands of hair clinging to her damp neck. She reached a trembling hand out toward me, though she did not dare close the physical distance. Her fingers curled inward, grasping at the empty air. "You cannot just leave," she pleaded, her breath hitching in her throat. "The banks! Lucas!" She looked back over her shoulder. Lucas was still sitting at the table, his phone pressed against his ear, dictating account numbers to the emergency legal hotline in a flat, robotic monotone. He was methodically dismantling her remaining access to the outside world. Sarah remained curled in her chair, weeping openly into her hands, mourning the loss of her unearned luxury. The few remaining guests had already vanished into the foyer, desperate to escape the blast radius of the implosion. "They are going to take the house," Victoria whispered, turning her terrified eyes back to me. "The lenders. They filed the notices. You showed them the papers. Lucas froze the trust. I have nothing, Isabella. The checking accounts are empty. The credit lines are maxed. I cannot even pay the catering staff in the kitchen." I stood perfectly still. I listened to her catalog her self-inflicted ruin. I felt no urge to comfort her. I felt no maternal pull. She was reciting a ledger of consequences, and I was merely the auditor, verifying the math. "Where am I supposed to go?" she asked, a fresh wave of tears spilling over her lower lashes. "The banks will lock the doors. They will change the security codes. I will be on the street." She took a hesitant step forward, lowering her chin, attempting to summon a fragile, pitiful demeanor. She was trying to play the role of the vulnerable elder, hoping to trigger a buried instinct of filial duty within my chest. "You have that beautiful house in the suburbs," she continued, her words tumbling out in a rapid, desperate rush. "You have the guest room over the garage, the one with the separate entrance. I could stay there, just for a little while, just until I sort out the lawyers and get back on my feet. I promise I will not be a burden. We can start over, Isabella. We can be a real family again." The sheer audacity of the request hung in the air, thick and cloying. Less than an hour ago, she stood at the head of this very table, tapping a silver spoon against crystal, dedicating all her energy to destroying my reputation. She had labeled me a discarded, unloved woman. She had hired an escort to frame my husband. She had tried to orchestrate a fraudulent divorce solely to steal my grandfather's money. And now, standing amidst the ashes of her failed conspiracy, she expected me to open my front door and offer her a warm bed. She believed the social contract of family required me to absorb her toxicity endlessly. She thought the word mother was a magical key that would unlock my forgiveness regardless of the crimes she had committed. I looked at her outstretched hand. I did not feel anger. The cold, calculated rage that had fueled me through the first 3 courses of the dinner had dissipated, leaving behind a profound, crystalline clarity. I opened the brass clasp of my leather clutch. I reached inside, my fingers bypassing my phone and my keys, and found the trifold paper pamphlet I had stored there 3 weeks ago. I knew this exact scenario was a mathematical certainty. When Julian first uncovered the predatory loans and the forged trust documents, I ran the projections. I knew the timeline of a commercial foreclosure. I knew Victoria had alienated every genuine friend she ever possessed, leaving her with a social circle composed entirely of fair-weather enablers who would scatter the moment her bank accounts ran dry. I knew she would have nowhere else to turn. I pulled the glossy brochure from my purse. I did not hand it to her. I extended my arm and placed it flat on the edge of the dining table, right next to a discarded linen napkin. "You can apply here," I said. My voice was cool, level, and entirely devoid of emotion. Victoria stared at the pamphlet. The glossy cover featured a stock photograph of a nondescript brick building surrounded by a modest chain-link fence. The bold text across the top read, "Connecticut State Department of Social Services, subsidized housing and elder care facilities." She recoiled as if the paper were radiating intense heat. Her eyes widened, scanning the words, processing the reality of the destination I was offering her. "This is a state-run facility," she breathed, her voice trembling with a fresh, profound horror. "This is Medicaid housing. It has linoleum floors. It has shared bathrooms. You expect me to live in a public ward? I expect you to live within your actual means," I corrected her. "The facility is clean. It is secure. It is exactly what you can afford." "I am your mother," she cried out, her voice cracking under the strain. "You cannot put me in a state home. Think of the humiliation. Think of what people will say. They will say you finally ran out of other people's money to spend," I replied, my tone unyielding. I turned away from the table. The transaction was over. The debt was settled. I reached for my dark wool winter coat, which I had draped over the back of a chair near the archway. I slid my arms into the heavy sleeves, feeling the comforting, insulated weight of the fabric settle over my shoulders. Julian stepped close. He did not say a word. He simply reached out and took my left hand in his. His grip was firm, warm, and deeply grounding. His fingers intertwined with mine, a silent, undeniable reaffirmation of the partnership we had built. He was the man she had tried to erase, and he was the only reason I was walking out of this house with my sanity intact. I looked back at the dining room one final time. The grand illusion was dead. The crystal chandelier seemed to cast a harsh, unforgiving light on the wreckage. Lucas was still barking orders into his phone, demanding emergency injunctions and asset freezes. Sarah was slumped over the mahogany, her sobs echoing off the plaster walls. And Victoria stood paralyzed near the edge of the table, staring down at the state housing brochure, realizing that her lifelong performance had finally culminated in an empty theater. I met my mother's terrified gaze. I delivered the final, undeniable truth that I had spent 32 years learning how to articulate. "Love isn't blood," I said, my voice echoing through the quiet spaces of the ruined room. "It's who shows up." I squeezed Julianne's hand, feeling the answering pressure in his fingers. "I'm done paying for your peace," I added, sealing the boundary forever. Julian and I turned our backs on the Greenwich estate and walked out into the foyer. Our footsteps echoed against the imported marble tiles, a steady, unified rhythm that carried us toward the exit. The heavy oak front doors loomed ahead, a threshold between the toxic history I was leaving behind and the honest future I was claiming. Julian reached out and pushed the heavy brass handle. The doors swung open, welcoming us with a rush of frigid, biting wind. We stepped out into the crisp Connecticut winter night. The air was sharp and immaculate tasting of pine needles and incoming frost. The sky above was a deep, inky expanse, dotted with cold, indifferent stars. The sensory contrast was staggering. The suffocating, perfumed heat of the mansion vanished, replaced by the clean, unforgiving chill of objective reality. Behind us, the sounds of the implosion continued to reverberate through the open doorway. The frantic, high-pitched wail of Victoria sobbing, mixed with the harsh, furious shouting of Lucas, demanding legal retribution. The noise was a chaotic symphony of consequence, but it felt incredibly distant. It was no longer my problem to solve. It was no longer my ledger to balance. Julian pulled the heavy oak doors shut behind us. The thick wood slammed into the doorframe with a resounding, heavy thud. The latch clicked into place, severing the noise, cutting off the sobbing and the shouting, and plunging the front porch into a serene, beautiful quiet. We walked down the stone steps together, our boots crunching against the thin layer of fresh snow dusting the gravel driveway. The cold air stung my cheeks, a sharp physical reminder that I was awake, alive, and entirely free. I looked at the dark sedan waiting for us at the end of the path. The engine was still running, the exhaust pluming into the cold night air, the heater waiting to warm us for the drive home. I tightened my grip on Julian's hand. I was no longer the frightened daughter trying to buy her mother's affection. I was no longer the silent appraiser documenting the decline of a corrupt dynasty. I was a woman who had audited her own life, identified the rot, and possessed the strength to walk away from the deficit. The boundary was permanently set. The debt was canceled. I breathed in the winter air, my chest expanding with a profound, unshakable sense of peace, deeply satisfied with the knowledge that my true worth had never been up for negotiation.